What if Deku had rewind and Immortality Quirk? How would this change everything? Before we start, I want you guys to subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, and also share this video with your friends. It will really mean a lot to me. You can also check other what ifs on the channel. The like aim for this video is 100. Your support keeps me motivated to bring more amazing what ifs for you guys. Now let's begin. Koch-chan's hand on his shoulder is smoldering hot, popping and crackling with little explosions that burn even through his middle school uniform. Izuku leans back, but Koch-chan leans forward, his breath minty and his eyes narrowed in anger, his grip tightening painfully on Izuku's shoulder. In other words, don't you dare get into you, nerd. Koch-chan growls, his words punctuated by a series of pops from his hand, and Izuku can't stop himself from breaking eye contact, his whole body shaking with stupid fear. He's still frozen there, in the almost empty classroom, while Koch-chan and his friends start to stalk out of the room, their shoes clicking on the linoleum tiles. Oh, and Deku. Koch-chan says. You want to be a hero? I've got an idea for you. His voice is mocking, light. Izuku doesn't turn to look at him. Take a swan dive from the roof and pray you get a quirk in the next life. He sneers, and that makes Izuku turn, makes his head whips around, eyes hot with tears. He tries to say something, anything, but something hot and ugly is bubbling up in his chest, and he can't say anything at all. Koch-chan narrows his eyes, raises a hand and lets off a small explosion. Yeah, what? He says, crackling smoke and light in his hand, before he turns and follows his buddies out of the classroom. Izuku can hear them whooping and laughing in the hallway. He thinks he hears someone tell Koch-chan that was funny. Funny? Izuku bites his lip, clenches and then clenches his fists. Idiot. If I jump, you'll be blamed for bullying me into suicide, he thinks. If I jump. Izuku walks slowly through the empty halls of Aldera Junior High. His shoulder hurts where Koch-chan burned it. His head hurts from his clogged sinuses, his nose and throat irritated from holding back tears. He walks out the front doors, turns to the little pond under the window, with the koi fish snipping at the edges of his precious notebook. That's not fish food, he mutters, his eyes filling with tears anew. He feels like he's going to be sick as he pulls his 13th analysis notebook out of the water, the ash sliding off and the water smearing the ink on the page. He tries to dry it off some with the edge of his sleeve, but the shiny fabric doesn't want to absorb the water. It smells like a camping trip, like old burnt-out flames in the green, swampy smell of a river or lake. Izuku clutches the notebook to his chest, lets himself sob quietly as he walks away from the school. The familiar sights are blurring together, probably since he's upset. Maybe that's why he misses the villain, doesn't see it coming. He certainly feels it though, green slime wrapping itself around his throat in a chokingly tight hold. The sludge grips him, and the villain laughs. Just calm down, he sneers. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds, and it'll all be over. His voice reminds Izuku of Koch-chan, for the briefest moment. He starts to fight back, then relaxes. The villain is fluid. He wouldn't be able to do anything anyway. He lets himself go limp, lets the villain force its way down his throat. It feels like choking, like swallowing something down the wrong pipe, but worse, like his lungs are going to split open. The villain smells vaguely like the car pond, sludgy and swampy and green. Izuku's vision is starting to go black when he wonders which hero is on duty today. Would they find him in time? He finds it hard to care as his vision cuts out completely, the sensation of choking replaced with a dull pain in his chest. It's not a swan dive off a roof, Koch-chan, but maybe I'll get a quirk in the next life anyway, he thinks as his consciousness slips away. Izuku opens his eyes, gasps for air. He reaches for his throat desperately, feeling nothing but clean skin. He's not outside in that tunnel, not surrounded by the fading afternoon light and green slime. He's in the classroom, and Koch-chan has a hand on his shoulder. Izuku coughs, rubbing at his throat. What the heck is wrong with you? Koch-chan asks, then shoves him aside. Whatever. I don't want to catch whatever he has. He says, taking a step away from Izuku and sulking after his friends. Izuku watches his back move, watches him pause in the doorway and turn his head back, a sneer on his lips. I meant it about you, Deku. If you show up there, I'll dispose you myself. Koch-chan spits, the flute landing on the floor in front of him. Izuku keeps a hand on his throat, panting as Koch-chan shrugs and leaves the classroom, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the desks closest to it. Izuku stares. I died. He blinks, looks down at his hands. They don't look any different. He doesn't feel any different. His chest doesn't hurt, doesn't burn. His uniform is clean and dry. His notebook is gone, probably in the koi pond where he'd found it before. Unless that was a daydream. Izuku's never been the daydreaming type before, not like that anyway. He shoves his shaking hands in his pockets and listens for the sounds of conversation, but Koch-chan and his buddies seem to have already left. He sighs in relief, then makes his way over to the door and opens it. He walks down the hallway, just like before. Walks to the koi pond. His notebook is there, floating as the fish investigate. No, he whispers, pulling it out and shaking it off, not bothering to wipe it off this time. Not for you guys. The fish don't reply, but they do swim away from where the notebook was, drifting idly in the little pond. Izuku stares at his reflection in the water, stained gray from the concrete below. He looks tired. Scared. Nothing abnormal. He doesn't know what just happened. He tucks his notebook under one arm and starts walking away from the school, taking a different route than before. Did he really die? The afternoon looks the same as before, warm golden light spilling across the ground from the sun, shadows angled and low. He walks along a brick wall for a bit, his shoes scraping on the concrete sidewalk, before he pauses. Is he under the effects of someone's quirk? He takes a breath, pauses. He doesn't have a dry notebook to write in right now, but he can think like he would when he's writing. What does he know? He knows he left school already once today. He knows he was attacked by a villain in the tunnel on the way home. He knows he didn't fight back, and as a result, he died. He knows he didn't actually die. He knows Koch-chan reacted to him acting strangely. What doesn't he know? He doesn't know if any of this is actually what happened. He doesn't know if he's under the effects of a quirk, or if he is, his quirk that would be. He doesn't know if fighting back against the villain would make any difference. Izuku does know one thing. If he wants to know if that was real, if that villain was actually there at the end of the tunnel, he's only got one way to find out. He turns on his heels and walks in the direction of the tunnel. His survival instincts scream at him not to, he's already died once. But Izuku doesn't want to leave this unsolved. After all, he already died once. If this is actually happening, some small part of him doesn't mind. He wonders if he'd be missed, but then he shakes his head. Of course, his mom would be devastated. He marches onward, turning on a familiar side street. He'll approach from the end of the tunnel the villain had been waiting in last time. Or at least he thinks. He wishes he'd been paying more attention last time, but he remembers Koch-chan's words. If he actually said them. Who's to say this isn't all Izuku's overactive imagination? He remembers being told to take a swan dive off the roof. He remembers the sneer on Koch-chan's face, the amusement of his friends. Izuku hopes that wasn't real, but something ugly in him twists and whispers that Koch-chan would say that to someone like you. He sees the tunnel entrance, and it looks a little odd to be facing this direction in the afternoon. Normally when he goes through it from this side, it's morning, with the sun behind him, and not crowning the top of the bridge above in an orange-yellow halo. He squints against the light. Hopefully, the villain didn't leave in the time it took Izuku to make this decision. He's not sure what he'd do if he couldn't confirm or deny that he died and, well, come back. He's not sure what to call it, to be honest. Izuku sees the villain before it sees him this time. It's a massive sludge already, meaning it likely didn't have a human form except for those eyes and that mouth. He gasps a little when he sees it slide out of the tunnel, and he covers his mouth too late, the villain's eyes swiveling to focus on him. The villain's mouth contorts into a white, ugly grin, and Izuku hears a familiar voice. Perfect. A medium-sized body to hide in, the villain rushes forward at him at that point, and even though Izuku braces himself, the impact still hurts. He covers his mouth and nose with his hands, writhing as the sludge wraps around him, squeezing. It's oddly dry for a sludge quirk, not sticking to his clothes so much as enveloping him. Izuku takes a deep breath of air before the sludge wraps around his hands where they guard his mouth and nose, and his hands ache from strain, as the sludge tries to push itself between his fingers. Smart hacking kid, the villain growls. Stop resisting. It's only gonna hurt more if you make me wait, he says, and Izuku thrashes harder at that, remembering the horrible choking sensation. Holding his breath like this is better, so much better. Even so, he can feel his limbs starting to grow weak. He can't pull his head out of the grip, even when he tosses his head back hard enough to make his neck ache. He thinks, hysterically, that he's going to die again. He can feel his eyes fill with painful tears, his chest burning from the lack of oxygen. His head starts to fill with fuzziness, and he realizes that the villain was right. It did hurt more to resist. Just as Izuku feels his limbs go limp, he hears a familiar voice. Fear not, kid. For I am here. All Might's voice rings out, and the hero punches the sludge villain hard enough that Izuku can feel the force as the villain is knocked off of him. He keeps his hands over his mouth and nose, gasping desperately for breath. He watches two tears hit the sidewalk below, turning it dark in two little circles, before he hits the ground. He tries to get up, but he's shaking too hard, dizzy and weak. He recognizes that he's lying on his side, limp, but he's not totally unconscious. Is he going to die anyway? Hey, All Might says, voice quieter, and he taps on the side of Izuku's face. Hey, kid. He says, a little louder, and it seems to be enough to wake Izuku's body up, and he opens his eyes the rest of the way. Oh, thank goodness. All Might says with a grin, standing up. Izuku pushes himself up onto his elbows, staring up at the hero. You're okay. Excellent. Wah, I'm sorry for getting you caught up in my villain hunt. All Might cuts him off, putting both hands on his hips. But my success here is all due to you. He says, grinning and holding up a bottle of familiar green sludge. I've contained the villain. Izuku blinks, then feels his face split in a grin as he hops to his feet. Wow. Oh, he reaches for the half-destroyed notebook where it fell on the ground. Can I get? He trails off, staring at the autograph already on the notebook. Thank you, he shouts, bowing to All Might. He straightens up to see the hero walking away from him. Now, I must get this to the authorities, All Might says, not even looking back at Izuku. He crouches down in what Izuku knows is his stance when he's preparing for a jump, and Izuku's legs move without him telling them to. He sprints at All Might, wrapping his arms around the hero's leg just in time as the hero shoots through the air. Izuku has to close his eyes against the rush of wind. Hey. He hears All Might's voice, muffled by the wind. I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this is too much. He kicks his leg a little. Get down. If I let go now, I'll die. Izuku shouts as a reply, his voice warped from the way the wind makes his lips and cheeks flap around. Right, All Might says, and Izuku sees him grimace. Well, hold on, and shut your eyes and mouth. Izuku complies, and he abruptly realizes that he's holding on to All Might's leg. He feels a rush of adrenaline push through him as they land on what looks like a rooftop. He opens his eyes and releases All Might, looking up to see his idol leaning on the railing of the roof, facing away from him. I have something I need to ask you, Izuku says, and All Might glances back at him. I don't have time. All Might says, crouching slightly, like he's going to jump again. Can someone become a hero, even without a quirk? Izuku gasps it out, taking a step towards his hero and squeezing his eyes shut, not willing to see the look on All Might's face. He needs to hear this. He needs someone to tell him he can be a hero. He starts to mutter about why he wants to be a hero, about All Might, saving people with a smile. He opens his eyes, and All Might is gone. An impostor, he shouts, taking a step back. You're an impostor, he asks the skeletal form, and its dark eyes track to his face, grimacing at him. No, he replies, and Izuku takes another step back. I'm All Might. You're all shriveled up, he replies, his voice barely a mumble, and he sees blood at All Might's mouth. You know how guys at the pool are always sucking in and flexing, and try to hold their buff? I'm like that. All Might says, and Izuku gapes. No way, he replies, staring at the skeletal person in front of him. He does resemble All Might, but in the same way that chopsticks resemble telephone poles. I'm counting on you to keep your mouth shut. Don't go talking about this online or telling your friends, All Might says, and he turns his head away from Izuku and lifts his shirt up with one hand. The scar he reveals is horrible, like he was grabbed at the chest and twisted. It's red and angry, with the veins visible under the thin skin, but the worst part is how sunken in it is. Izuku covers his mouth with a hand to stop himself from gasping at it, and All Might lets his shirt flutter back down with a sigh. Pretty gross, right? I got this from a big fight 5 years back. My respiratory system was basically destroyed. I lost my whole stomach. All the surgeries have pretty much worn me out, and it can't be fixed. Right now, I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day. The rest of the time, this is what I look like. He turns away from Izuku again. 5 years ago. Izuku mumbles. Does that mean the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? All Might glances back at him and chuckles. No. You know your stuff, but Toxic Chainsaw isn't strong enough to do something like this. The fight with this person, it was never publicized. I did everything I could to keep it under wraps. I'm supposed to be the guy who always smiles, right? I'm the symbol of peace. People everywhere have to think that I'm never afraid. But honestly, I smile to hide the fear inside. He cracks a painful-looking smile. It's just a brave face I put on when the pressure is high. This job isn't easy, he frowns. Pro heroes are always having to risk their lives. Some villains just can't be beaten without powers. So no, I honestly don't think you can be a hero without a quirk. He meets Izuku's eyes, and Izuku tries not to cry. He feels the tears rising, biting at his eyes, but thankfully All Might turns away from him. If you want to help people, there's plenty of other ways to do it. You can become a police officer. They get crap because the heroes capture most of the villains, but it's a fine profession. It's not bad to have a dream, young man, just make sure your dreams are obtainable, realistic, understand? All Might rambles on, coughing a bit when he finishes, but Izuku can't process the words. He can be a hero. If All Might said it, it must be true, right? He can't be a hero. An explosion rings out from behind him, probably a few blocks away, but still loud enough to make him gasp. All Might turns, grits his teeth. I have to go check that out, he says, not even looking at Izuku. You knock on the door and I'm sure the people downstairs will let you in if it's locked. He doesn't make eye contact, just puffs back into his muscle form and coughs before jumping away. Izuku just stares. Izuku wonders, briefly, if he could have said something different. If he'd worded it differently. Maybe if he'd taken down the villain himself, instead of waiting. He wonders if he'd get a second chance, if he died. He looks around. The building is taller than the others around, and all of the other roofs are empty. All Might probably landed here because it was tall. The only thing stopping him is a chain link fence around the perimeter of the roof. Izuku walks up to it, climbs it. The metal digs into the flesh of his hands, and he pauses at the top. What if he doesn't wake up, like last time? What if he doesn't die? He looks down, and his head swims sickeningly at the distance. Oh, he'll die. He doesn't stop to let himself have more time to think about this. He scrambles over the edge of the chain link fence and steps onto the thin ledge between him and the 10-story. More. He can't tell. Full. he takes a deep breath and jumps. As he falls, he lets himself think about it. He lets himself think that if he wakes up, if things go back again, it means that he does have a quirk. It means he really can take a swan dive off a roof and hope for better luck in his next life. It means that all along, he's been useless and worthless because he hasn't died yet. He hits the ground. Izuku opens his eyes, expecting Koch-chan's hand on his shoulder and the fluorescent lights of his classroom, but instead the wind blowing across the roof whips against his face. He's staring at the chain-link fence, from where he was standing when All Might jumped away. He sees the clouds drifting across the sky, high above the buildings, tinted orange with the setting sun. He blinks. He has a quirk. The thought is foreign to him, and he doesn't know what to think other than he has a quirk. It didn't make sense, really. He'd been diagnosed quirkless at age 5 based on the fact that despite him lacking the extra toe joint, a battery of tests hadn't revealed any evidence of a quirk. He was told that this just happens, sometimes. It's caused by 2 quirks cancelling each other out completely, or by having a latent quirk so weak it was undetectable. Sometimes, too, genetics regress. The quirk family might have a child that lacks the genes for a quirk, but kept the evolved toes. He should pick a different dream. Nobody's quirks had ever manifested past the age of 6, anyway. He'd held out until his 6th birthday before he had let himself believe it, and here he was, 14, and learning of his quirk for the first time. Izuku couldn't die. He sits down on the concrete rooftop, breathes. If he does, he's taken back to shortly before the event. He's not sure how far back it will go, though. Does it depend on what disposition? He starts to take out his notebook to write in it when the sound of another explosion catches his attention. He looks in the direction it came from just in time to see another one, bright and flashy. It looks kind of familiar. Before he knows what he's doing, he's rushing in the direction of the blasts. He doesn't think he wants to analyze the heroes working the rescue, not after what just happened anyway. It wouldn't feel right. But he still finds himself running along the streets, towards the sounds of a struggle. He feels his heart beating fast in his chest as he rounds the corner to see that same sludge villain. He gasps. He recognizes it, and he stands on his tiptoes to see over the crowd. There's a shock of blonde hair in the villain's grasp, and Izuku feels dread gather in the pit of his stomach. Did he make All Might drop the bottle when he grabbed onto him? If so, this would be his fault. He sees the boy in the villain's grasp twist, grabbing a breath of air, just as another volley of explosions go off. Izuku finds his breath taken away when he recognizes Koch-chan, his face red from exertion and damp from sweat. Why weren't the heroes stepping in? Izuku glances around desperately, only to see a hero working to put out the fires and another gathering civilians, but none of them helping Koch-chan. He doesn't even think, his legs carry him on his own as he pushes through the crowd and runs at the villain. He doesn't know what to do, though, and when he gets to the villain, it's ready for him. It slams a mass of thick sludge into his face, knocking him into the asphalt. A burst of red-hot pain erupts on the side of his head, and woozily, he pulls himself up. The villain is right in front of him. Koch-chan struggles, making the sludge writhe and bubble. The villain lurches towards him, and a flash of an explosion is the last thing he sees. When Izuku blinks his eyes open, he's back on top of the roof. He swears he can still feel the heat of the explosions, but this time he doesn't hesitate to run down the stairs, through the streets. He rushes at the villain again, this time from the side, but Koch-chan's quirk disposes him before he can even get close. On the 3rd try, he takes a second to blink the sunspots out of his eyes before he moves. The roof is as quiet and windy as ever, and Izuku can hear the sounds of Koch-chan's quirk, like before, but he doesn't rush. He sits down and opens his notebook, flipping through the pages. He's delighted to see that it's all still legible, at least for him reading his own handwriting, anyway. He flips through the pages, looking for anything he'd written down about villains similar to this one. His heart thumps in his chest, and he wants nothing more than to get down there, to save Koch-chan, but he doesn't. He doesn't get up, even though he remembers how it felt to have the villain choking you while you fart back, remembers the desperate plea in Koch-chan's eyes. He doesn't move, because he knows from personal experience that he will die if he doesn't go in with a game plan. If he takes too long, well, he'll just dispose himself and rewind. Izuku finds a page in his journal, just a half-filled one, but it's what he needs. It's over an intern, a hero in training who can turn herself into water, all except for her head. It's a good power, but he's written down the weaknesses, including the fact that her head clearly being solid, gives it away as her weak point. Seeing it, written so plainly, Izuku feels dumb. He gathers up his bag and his notebook and runs to the scene, hoping he'll get there in time, and won't have to die to make this work. The scene isn't any different from last time, except there's more fire, and the crowd watching has grown bigger. Izuku feels a swell of anger at that as he pushes through the crowd. The heroes are right here, and they haven't done anything. They're watching Koch-chan choke and die, and they aren't moving because they aren't a good match. Izuku bites his lip to stop himself from making a face. He forces his way through the barrier, ignoring shouts behind him, and lobs his backpack at the villain's eyes. He sees it hit out of the corner of his eye as he whips around to glare directly at Camille Woods. The icy pants, pointing at the sludge villain and praying Kamui listens to him, and moves before the villain recovers. Hit it in the eyes. Kamui's eyes widen slightly and he nods, whipping out 2 wooden branches to smack the villain in its eyes, right as it opens the one Izuku's backpack had hit. The pain seems to be enough, and Koch-chan struggles free, dropping onto the ground gasping for air. The ground around him crackles with the force of the explosion he lets off, and then he's on his feet, stumbling towards the police officers that are grabbing onto Izuku and pulling him back. Koch-chan makes eye contact with him as the other heroes jump into the fray, apparently spurred on by Kamui fighting the villain. Without Koch-chan setting off new explosions, it looks like the fire isn't a big issue for them. Izuku stares as Kamui wraps a wooden tendril around the sludge villain's mouth like a gag. "Hey, kid," the officer next to him says, nudging him. "You alright? You really shouldn't cross police barriers." Izuku looks up and nods. "I'm okay. Sorry." The officer shrugs. "You had a smart idea." He looks back over at the fight, and Izuku slips behind him, pushing back into the crowd. A couple of people say something to him, but he ignores it, walking away from the scene. He'll get his backpack later, when the fires have gone out. His notebook is plenty burned already. For right now, all he wants to do is sleep. A hand on his shoulder stops him, and he turns to see the skeleton form of All Might. Kid, All Might says. "You've got a good head on your shoulders." He sighs. "I know I was harsh earlier, but you'd make a really good detective. Don't let your dream get in the way of your potential." He smiles at Izuku, but it looks creepy in this form. Izuku smiles back, but it doesn't reach his eyes. "It's okay. Thank you, All Might," he says, then brushes the hand off of his shoulder and walks away. He doesn't need All Might's approval, not anymore. He isn't quirkless. He has a quirk, and he isn't going to let it go to waste. School seems so stupid, now that it's so close to the end of the year. Izuku knows he should be paying attention to his teachers, but it's hard when he knows that he has a quirk. He hasn't told anyone, though. He stares out the window of the classroom, picking at the edge of his notebook. Koch-chan's mom had brought it over after the incident, saying she'd heard from Kamui that he had the idea to aim for the eyes. She told him to be careful, that Koch-chan was recovering fine. Izuku's written in it nearly non-stop since, filling it with theories about his own quirk, but keeping the writing in third person. He flips to the most recent page, stares at the sloppy handwriting, the smudges of pencil lead from being opened and shut too many times. It's not like he shouldn't tell anyone, he thinks. His mom would be horrified, that's for sure, but she'd still be happy for him. The issue is he doesn't think anybody but his mom would believe him. It's only rational. If he, a 14-year-old professional diagnosed as quirkless, suddenly started claiming to have a quirk that he couldn't prove existed, he'd get brushed off as lying to make things better for himself. He doesn't want the bullying to get worse, not even as much as some small part of him wants to tell the bullies, and then dispose himself in front of them to see their reactions. What is wrong with him? The thing is, now that he knows it isn't permanent, and that he's done it before, suicide doesn't sound so terrifying. It doesn't sound so forbidden, so out of reach. He finds himself daydreaming about it. He's already considered the fact that his quirk might have a limit, but it would likely be time-based, not a total number of maximum uses. Maybe if he dies in quick succession, too quickly for his quirk to rewind time, he'll stay dead. He doesn't plan to push it, not like that, but he figures that between jumping off the roof and getting blown up by Koch-chan, he probably was alive only 5 minutes. As long as he doesn't push that boundary, doesn't try anything funny like disposing himself 5 times in 5 seconds, he should be fine. He's already considered the fact that his quirk is likely time-related, in general. He's not reviving after dying, he's rewinding to before he died in the first place. It's different from a regeneration quirk because it means that nobody will ever have to know. It also means he won't heal from wounds, and that if he does die, he doesn't necessarily know how far back he'll be when he wakes up. He's okay with that though. So far it seems that he's rewound the minimum amount back to prevent him from immediately dying again, which should give him time to make minor changes to actions. He wonders if, with training, he could control where it rewinds to. He doesn't know where to start with that though. The final bell ringing jolts him out of his thoughts, and he hears someone laugh at whatever face he must be making. He feels his cheeks color, realizing that a group of about 4 kids is staring at him, grins on their faces. Koch-chan is there, too, but he's just sitting on his desk and staring at Izuku with a blank look. "Hey, Deku," one of the other boys says, slamming a hand down on his desk. "Still trying to study quirks? Didn't we tell you that was a waste of time?" Izuku looks up at him and swallows. He'd avoided major beatings since the sludge villain incident, and honestly, he isn't really looking forward to the next one. Oi. Izuku snaps his head around to look at Koch-chan, who's standing next to his chair instead of sitting in it. "Deku is mine today. None of you extras are gonna interfere, got it?" The guy leaning on Izuku's desk backs up, raising both hands. "Alright, fine. But you gotta save some of the fun for the rest of us, Bakugo." Koch-chan just snarls at him, and he shrugs in response, walking out of the classroom. The rest of the class drains out after him, but Izuku just stares at Koch-chan where he's standing in front of his desk, glaring down at Izuku. "What did you think you were hecking doing? Koch-chan asks, his lip curling over his teeth. What? Izuku asks, confused. He scoots his chair back slightly so he can stand up if he needs to, but Koch-chan leans forward and grabs his collar in one hand, dragging him forward until they're both leaning over the desk. What the hecking sludge villain? What the heck was that? Koch-chan snarls, and Izuku can smell his breath, can feel the moisture on his face. Izuku screws his eyes shut. You look like you needed help. He braces himself for a hit, but Koch-chan just drops him, and he's so startled by it that he almost knocks his chin against the desk. He glances up, startled, and see Koch-chan stomping out of the classroom. Stay out of my hecking way, Deku. Koch-chan shouts when he sees Izuku looking. I didn't need any hecking help. He says it like it's poisonous, then turns and walks out the classroom door. Izuku stares. He feels like he has deja vu, which is kind of funny because well he has lived through some stuff twice. This particular encounter isn't one of those times. Izuku gets the idea one evening when he's in his room, tucked under a blanket and watching hero videos on his phone. He watches Mount Lady slam a villain into the ground and he thinks, maybe I could do that. Not the slamming into the ground. He's not strong enough for that, but it occurs to him that it's not like he could die. He wouldn't be in any danger, as a hero. He couldn't get hurt. He could throw himself into dangerous rescues, and not only would he survive, he would get multiple tries. He shuts his phone off and stares into the blackness of his room. He could be a hero. It's not unattainable, but the thing is, he doesn't want to be a hero with a quirk. He wants to be the first quirkless hero, he realizes, clenching his hands into fists and staring at his dark ceiling. Even if he isn't actually quirkless, he'll essentially be fighting like he is. His quirk isn't any good in combat or rescue, not unless he literally dies. His quirk also leaves no evidence that he knows of. Nobody would know. And even if he isn't actually quirkless, he thinks, wouldn't it be nice for the quirkless kids growing up? Wouldn't it help them, even if they're still bullied and told they're useless and beaten up? Wouldn't it help someone, for there to be a publicly quirkless hero? So he decides right then, bundled up in his comforter, in the dark in his room after school. He's going to apply to UA. He's going to get in. He'll get multiple tries, won't he? If he messes up the first time, well he can just take a swan dive off a roof, and hope for better luck in the next life. He realizes though, that he has no practice, no training, and no quirk to compensate for his lack of ability. He could probably get into UA with enough tries anyway, but he doesn't know how far back he'll reset. What if it's midway through the test, and he can't prepare it all no matter what? He needs to train, somehow. He turns over in bed, shuts his eyes. He'll figure something out. He always does. The Gaba beach is an ugly, messy thing. The gym keeps covering the expanse of it all are unsightly, and the stench of the rotting seaweed mixed with old garbage is enough to make Izuku gag as he picks his way through the trash to the shore, where clear water brushes up against his shoes. He stares at it. He thought the water would be nasty too, for some reason, but it's sparkling and clear, like glass. The sand underneath is a pale brown, speckled with bits of shells. Seafoam clings to the sand when the water pulls back, looking like suds from a bath. He's come up with a couple of ideas since he had his realization about being a hero. The first is to clean the beach. It's messy, and it's local enough that not a lot of people go here, anyway. Nobody else is cleaning it up. It'll help him train his body. Second, he thinks he's going to start exploring the streets at night. Nothing crazy, he's not going to go looking for dark alleyways to get abducted in. But now he doesn't have to be afraid of getting dispossessed in some damn corner. He can get a feel for what it looks like, at night, when crime actually takes place. He'll have to be a popular hero, a famous one, for his quirklessness to actually help things for other quirkless kids out there, but he thinks, well, some part of him, at least, feels sick at the idea of smiling and laughing and praising All Might in public. It had started with vague disappointment, after All Might told him he couldn't be a hero, but it twisted into something like resentment the more he thought about it. Izuku leans down, picking up an empty beer can, and shoving it into the black plastic garbage bag he'd brought with him, grimacing. He'll need to buy gloves unless he wants to get his hands cut up. Cleaning the beach is hard work. He expected it to be difficult because some of the stuff is heavy, but it's also a lot of walking. His garbage bag gets full really quickly, and he has to walk back to his house. His mom opens the door for him, smiling. "Oh, Izuku," she says, ushering him inside. "How's the cleaning going?" He smiles at her. "It's okay. I need to get more garbage bags, though." He told her about what he was doing this morning before he headed out, and she thought it was a wonderful idea. "Of course," he says, ducking into the kitchen. "Should I just give you the whole box?" "Yes, please." He chirps back, and he enjoys the cool breeze of the air conditioning while he waits. He hears the cabinet door shut and his mom's footsteps as she walks back over to him. "Here you go, sweetie." She hands him the box with a grin. "Don't forget to stay hydrated. Oh, and if you get hungry, there's onigiri in the fridge." He nods, smiling at her. "Thanks, Mom." He waves at her and ducks back outside, hopping down the steps and back to the beach. It goes faster from that point, since he's getting used to the routine. He's starting with the small stuff, little pieces that broke off of things and litter that washed up on shore, but he can see the difference in the beach after only a few hours. There's more space to walk between the junk, less wrappers and empty bottles scattered in the sand. He thinks it might smell a little better, too, but that might just be his nose getting used to the stench. By the time the sun is low in the sky, hanging over the horizon and painting everything in bright peach hues, he's tired and sweaty but feels good. He feels like he's doing something. He might not have done much, but it's better than nothing, right? He sleeps deeply that night, dreaming of UA and heroism for the first time since he died. A few nights later, he's on the streets. It's after dark, and he feels a little bad about sneaking out through his window, but he knows it would only worry his mom if she knew he was out this late in the night. It's just past 11 p.m., and the sky is as dark as it ever gets in the city. The moon is fat and bright in the sky, not quite full but almost there. Izuku walks through the street, hands tucked in his hoodie pockets. He feels a little weird, walking this route when it's dark instead of during the day on the way to school, but it's also strangely relaxing. He knows he isn't going to run into his bullies, at least. That's probably why he's surprised when he hears the sounds of an argument, low and muffled. He stops, turns and slowly walks in the direction of the noise, pressing his back to the brick wall that borders the next turn. He hears the voices more clearly now, and he knows they're just around the next corner. Dude, the first voice says, pleading and nervous. I swear, I'll have enough money next week. I really thought I'd have enough by now, I swear. Izuku hears the sound of something clicking. It sounds familiar, but he can't place it. Is that so? Another voice replies, this one lower and rougher. It's too bad that I'm impatient. Izuku winces as he hears a sickening thud, like someone had just hit human flesh with something heavy. Without giving himself a chance to think about it, Izuku glances around the corner, trying to keep himself hidden. He sees two men, both fairly fit, but one is a lot taller than the other, and holding a gun. Izuku feels the blood drain from his face, as he realizes the sound he heard earlier must have come from the man messing with it. It's a shiny black handgun, and from the smear of blood on the butt of it, and the bruising cut on the smaller man's forehead, the larger man had just hit him with it. Neither of them seem to notice Izuku as he glances over the situation. They're both dressed in casual clothes, but the larger man is wearing a leather jacket and heavy boots, while the smaller one wears nothing to protect his arms and has on sandals. Only one of them knew to expect a fight, he realizes, and his breath catches in his throat when the larger man fiddles with the gun, making another clicking noise. You know what time it is? The man asks, bananing the gun and pointing it at the smaller man's head. The smaller man just shakes his head, biting at his lip and raising his hands in a pleading gesture. Izuku moves before he can think, his legs not obeying his orders to stay still. He rushes out, tackling the smaller man to the ground, just as the larger man shoots, the gunshot loud and painful in his ears. He winces as he lands on his butt, the smaller man right next to him, looking dazed. Run. Izuku says, his voice quieter than he'd meant. Get out of here. He shoves at the smaller man, shocked when the guy stands up and complies with his orders. He sprints out of the alleyway, whimpering. Izuku sighs a breath of relief, then looks up. The larger man has his jaw clenched, and he's shaking with rage, his pupils tiny pinpricks. Hecking Kitty snarls, and that's the only warning Izuku gets before the back of the gun is whacked against his cheek, painful and hot. What the heck do you think you're doing? Izuku reaches up a hand to touch his cheek. He feels blood, and weirdly enough the only thing he can think about is that his mom will be worried about the cut. He stares up at the man, and he realizes he's started to tremble. He bites his lips. I'm sorry, he says, pleading with his eyes. The man groans, then kicks Izuku in the stomach. God, I'm not going to shoot a hecking kid. Stay the heck out of my way. He kicks Izuku again, this time hitting his ribs and knocking him a few feet back. He grunts and starts away, headed in the direction the smaller man ran off in, but not even walking particularly fast. Izuku stares after him. What on earth was I thinking, he wonders, reaching up to feel his cheek again. The adrenaline pumping through his veins is dulling the pain, making him feel like a live wire. It's not like it would have helped the other guy if Izuku had died. Everything would have just reset, so why did he bother? Except, Izuku thinks, I didn't die. It's strange to think he might have saved a life tonight. Even if the larger man catches up with the smaller guy now, maybe there was at least a chance to call the cops. Izuku wonders, for a moment, if he could do it again. If he could go find another fight, break it up with his body. Either he dies and nothing happens, or he lives and he saves someone. It's a win-win. Well, more of a win-neutral, anyway. Izuku stands up, wincing at the way his ribs ache. Those would bruise in the morning. It isn't the worst he's had, though. He starts to walk back home, picking his way through the streets, and if he starts thinking about what he'd need to do to conceal his identity, if he kept this up, well, that's nobody's business but his own. Izuku feels silly, at the costume store. He's one of the only people in this store in the first place, and considering that it's late February, nobody is getting a costume for Halloween or Hero Day. It's chilly outside today, and Izuku is honestly kind of enjoying the heating in the costume store. He walked here as soon as school let out, but his uniform isn't quite warm enough for this weather. He'll have to keep that in mind when designing his costume, he thinks. Izuku doesn't need to get everything from here, anyway. He's already placed orders online for a long-sleeved black shirt that had a high collar, and was made of activewear material, whatever that meant. He's already got a pair of black boots in his closet, a gift from his mom for Christmas. They'd be perfect for vigilante work, although his mom had gotten them with the intent of him using them at UA. Vigilante work, huh? He thinks, smiling to himself as he pulls a matching pair of red gloves out of a bin. He's not sure he really considers what he's planning vigilante work exactly, but that's the closest description he'd come up with, anyway. He's already decided that his nighttime outfit needs to be as different as possible from his daylight costume. He's been planning something green and All Might inspired for his hero costume for ages, and he knows that even though All Might isn't his favorite anymore, he's more than a little attached to the designs he's made. For his vigilante work, then, he decided on a red and black theme. The black because it'd be easier to blend in with the shadows, and the red because it's the opposite of his green daylight concept. The gloves he's holding, clearly an adaptation on workout gloves but dark crimson red for hero cosplay, are a perfect touch. He'll need something like this to prevent fingerprints. He holds onto the gloves and walks over to a display of belts. Most of them are styled after specific heroes. This shop specializes in cosplay, after all. There's also plain belts in most colors, though, for cosplaying lesser known heroes or for other uses. Izuku picks out one that matches his gloves and has a good number of pouches and hooks on it. He thinks it's supposed to be an imitation of one of the ones Crimson Riot used to wear, but he isn't totally sure. It's made of woven fabric, and the tag says it's fireproof, as is usually required for costume material. Izuku remembers reading about it in class. Since people in costumes tend to use their quirks, either for hero work or for reenactments, they're supposed to be at least minimally resistant to fire, to the point where they wouldn't instantly go up in flames on contact with fire. It'll be good enough for what Izuku is doing. He looks over the pants briefly, but he's decided to just wear a pair of sturdy bulk jeans, anyway. He hasn't really worn them out before, since he's usually in his uniform or workout clothes lately, so they wouldn't be recognizable to his daytime identity, anyway. He walks over to a display of masks. Most of them aren't suitable. They either don't cover enough, imitate a hero, or they look like they'd make fighting hard. He stops when he sees a display of face masks modeled after surgical masks, just plain ones that cover your mouth and nose. He pauses, grabbing a plain black one and holding it. He'd need another piece to cover his eyes, but he glances around, spotting a display of safety glasses and goggles. He grins. Eye protection is a good idea anyway, and this way he won't have to worry about his face or his eyes giving him away. He glances over the options for a moment before selecting a pair of reflective goggles, a shiny red mirror that shows his own face. He tries them on, and they aren't tinted, which will be great for nighttime. He carefully puts the goggles in his growing armful of stuff, then turns to get his last item. He goes to a display of washout hair dye, and grabs the largest multi-use bottle of black dye they have. He knows that out of anything, with everything covering his body and face, his hair would be the most likely to give it away. Curly hair alone, in a plain unassuming black, though, it'd do the trick. He goes to the checkout counter and dumps everything he's bought on the glass surface. The guy behind the register looks bored as he rings everything up. "Who are you dressing up as?" he asks, then reads the total cost to Izuku. "He's an original character," Izuku says, smiling as he hands over the money. Izuku waits to go out in his costume until the beach is nearly halfway clear, and his muscles no longer ache when he tries to move some of the bigger things. He hasn't been able to budge some of the objects, but he knows he'll get there. That's why he's doing this now. It'll let him train parts of him that the beach doesn't, like stealth and dexterity. He hops out of his window and onto the soft path of dirt beneath him. He's wearing his long-sleeved shirt, a maroon hoodie, black jeans, his boots, and the utility belt he'd bought. The mask and reflective goggles have his face covered, and his hair is dyed a deep black that doesn't show a lick of green in the dim light. He's pulled it back into what must be the world's tiniest ponytail, his mom's hair tie at the nape of his neck, and just barely holding everything in, but he knows he's completely unrecognizable, which is exactly the point. He steps onto the street, glancing around to double-check that he's alone before he starts along the road, walking with his shoulders straight and his hands in his pockets. The gloves, hoodie, and mask together help, but the air still chills his skin, and he picks up the pace into a light jog, his boots tapping on the concrete. His breath comes easier than it would have even a few weeks ago, before he started cleaning up the beach. He relishes the sting of the cold air in his throat, and he catches himself smiling as he jogs along. Unsurprisingly, the streets are pretty quiet. The area of Misatafu that he and his mom live in is a calm, residential area. He's thought about the act of finding crime itself quite a lot. He must have been lucky to stumble on that fight the first night. It wouldn't necessarily be easy to find these things in the first place. After all, part of the goal of the criminals would be to stay hidden, wouldn't it? The crickets chirping in the long grasses poking out between the sidewalk and the wall seem to agree with him, singing happily in their homes. He can hear his footsteps echoing against the concrete ground and the brick walls that border the yards in this part of the city, too loud in the night. He'll need to learn how to walk more quietly, he thinks. He turns down a road that he knows leads into the nastier part of the city, even if it is still a few blocks away. The buildings up ahead went up quickly, cheaply constructed from concrete and iron. They look like they're older than they are, with vines twisting on some of their sides and cracks on others. This is where the people who can't afford to live anywhere else go, where the seediest bars and the strangest clubs lurk. If he's going to find crime, it'll be over here. It takes him the better part of an hour to find anything, and that's probably why he finds himself about to keep walking when he hears it. It's hard to tell what exactly he hears that sounds of. He stops, standing under a streetlight that casts yellow light over the ground, flickering ever so slightly. He can hear the bulb inside buzzing, and watches as a group of moths bump around the light, knocking into the case surrounding it. They look black on the bright backdrop of the light, orange-yellow and flickering as it is. Izuku watches a moth circle it lazily as he listens to what sounds like a group of guys joking around. The voices are coming from the alleyway just past the streetlight, and Izuku really isn't sure why he's stopped in the first place. It sounds like just 2 or 3 guys, and he hears one of them laugh, happy and deep. They're probably just drunk and playing around, he thinks, and he goes to move on when he hears something else. He can't be quite sure, but he thinks he hears a woman's voice, pleading and squeaky. He thinks that he must have heard it before, but not registered it consciously, and he strains to listen as he slips into the alleyway, pressing himself against the building closest to him, the concrete surface smooth and cool. The shadow of the building seems to do a good job of keeping him hidden, because as he inches along the alleyway, none of the people at the end of it seem to see or hear him. He can see 3 men, just teenagers, really. He thinks they might be 16 or 17, not much older than him. They're laughing, shoving at each other, and grinning, but what makes Izuku grit his teeth and inch closer is the woman they're cornering against a wall. She's their age, dressed in similar clothes to them, too. Izuku notes that they're all wearing the same uniform under their jackets. They're probably from the same high school, he registers, creeping closer. He kneels behind a dumpster that blocks his path along the side of this building. It stinks of rotten food, but he's used to it after all of that time on the beach. He can hear the conversation much more clearly from here, and he studies the shadows of the guys' legs as they move, cool black on the cool gray concrete. The light seems to be coming mostly from the moon up above. Izuku can't see even a hint of the yellow from the streetlight. "Come on," one of the guys says, his voice nasally and high. "You should come back to my place with us. It'll be fun," he says, a smile in his voice. "I told you," the girl replies, voice wavering. "I want to go home." One of the guys snorts, and Izuku hears what sounds like someone kicking the ground, a large scuffing noise. "Oh, really?" A different guy speaks. "You're going to let us get this far and then reject us? Not cool." This guy sounds older than the other one, although not by much. "Dude, let's just take her," the third man says. "With my quirk, we can just..." Izuku hears the girl shriek, then get cut off like something covered her mouth. He grits his teeth, then scoots forward on his feet to peer around the dumpster. The tallest of the guys, a skinny one wearing a yellow hoodie, has a hand raised, each finger turning into a thick rope that extends over to where the girl is pressed against the wall in fear. 3 ropes are wrapped around her forearms and waist, binding them together, and the other 2 are wrapped around her mouth like a gag. "Nice," the second voice whistles from where he's watching, wearing a green windbreaker. "Let's..." And that's when Izuku moves, even though he doesn't know how he's going to swing this or how on earth he's going to get that girl out of harm's way. He runs at the man with the rope hand quirk, launching himself up onto the man's shoulders and then leaning backward, trying to pull him down. It works, but he lands on top of Izuku, and he's heavy. Izuku hits the ground and gasps, feeling all of the air pushed out of his lungs at once. The man he pulled over screams, and the one with the green jacket shouts, but all Izuku cares about as he cranes his neck up to look as if the woman got away. He sees her, ropes loosened but not dropped. She struggles for a second, then gets her hands out of the ropes and pushes them off of her. She starts to try and run, but the first guy to speak catches her, his denim jacket almost gray in the darkness. He grabs her shoulders and grips her what must be painfully tight, and Izuku grits his teeth, kicking at the body squirming on top of him. He feels an impact on his stomach as the man kicks at him, but the motion frees him from the man's weight. Izuku pushes himself up into a crouch, then springs back when the yellow hoodie guy, still on the ground, throws a messy punch at his face. His hands, Izuku notes, are rope all of the time, and as he jumps to his feet, he wonders why the guy wouldn't have used his quirk on him. Maybe he forgot. Izuku scrambles back, shooting a glance to where the girl is struggling to get out of her captor's arms, kicking back at his shins and biting his arm where it's holding her. The man screams, and Izuku realizes that the girl's teeth are unnaturally sharp, arranged like fangs on a cartoon vampire. It must be part of her quirk, and the guy quickly drops her, swearing and pressing a hand to the bleeding wound in his forearm. "Son of a pathetic," he curses, turning to run after her, but Izuku dives at his legs, trying to somewhat repeat his stunt from earlier with the rope hand guy. It doesn't knock bleeding arm guy over, though, just sends him stumbling back a few steps, grunting in surprise. Hecking brat, someone spits from just behind Izuku, and suddenly the breath is knocked out of him, a sneakered foot digging into his ribs with a strong kick. Izuku is knocked away from the guy with the bleeding arm, and he lands on his back, one hand bracing himself and the other raised to try and block any incoming hits. He winces as another foot comes flying at him, this one aimed at his face, and his hand softens the blow, but gives him a flare of pain in his palm. What the guy with the green windbreaker sneers, "Do you think you're some kind of hero dressed up in that bull?" He kicks Izuku's shin. "That damn bleeding arm," guy says, hand still clamped over his arm. "I'm gonna have to get hacking stitches." Izuku pushes himself off the ground, trying to get up so he can run away, but he feels something rough and tight wrap around his thigh, and yank him back to the ground. He looks up to see the guy with the ropes for hands leering down at him, his lip bloody where he must have bit it when Izuku knocked him over. He feels dread pull in the pit of his stomach when he realizes he's not only cornered, but also caught, and he reaches his hands down to try and loosen the rope wrapped around his thigh, just above the knee. He scrabbles at it, but he can't even get his gloved hands underneath the rope, it's too tight. He glances back up, looking desperately for an escape route, but the three men are all facing him now, windbreaker guy with a terrifying grin on his face. Bloody arm guy spits at him, and Izuku turns his head just in time to avoid the spit hitting his face. He's glad he did when he hears a sizzle where the spit landed on the wall behind him, and he can't see it, but he can smell something sulfurous. He clenches his jaw and hopes that they dispose him quickly so he can try again. Maybe next time, he'll be smart enough to bring a weapon at least. He's practically fighting quirkless, as is. Rope guy yanks, and Izuku shuts his eyes and braces himself as he's dragged across the dirty concrete. He feels someone stomp down on his stomach, and then abruptly, he hears a shout, and the weight is gone. The rope around his thigh loosens, and he opens his eyes in surprise. He sees something that looks like bandages floating in the air around him, a thick canvas-like fabric that whips around and wraps around rope guy. Izuku sits up, pushing himself back and away from the other two guys, but it doesn't seem to matter because they both turn and start to run. "Not so fast," a low, adult voice growls, and Izuku watches as a man clad in all black with golden goggles steps out from behind rope guy, brandishing the fabric. It quickly snaps to wrap around the other two, tying bloody arm guy and windbreaker guy together in one wrapping of white material. Izuku scrambles up to his feet, watching as the new man's black hair falls down from where it had been floating above his head, landing on his shoulders in a mess of black curls. The man steps into the alleyway, his face turned to Izuku, now. Izuku bites his lip and he presses himself to the wall of the alley. Suddenly, it clicks. He recognizes him. Eraserhead, he breathes, and Eraserhead quirks an eyebrow at him. The Erasure hero. It occurs to him all at once that not only is he dressed like a one-up hero, or villain, in front of an actual pro who he is a fan of, but also that Eraserhead is quite possibly the most dangerous person in the entire world for him. If he erases Izuku's quirk and Izuku dies, he wouldn't come back. The girl said someone wearing a cosplay had saved her, Eraserhead says, voice unreadable. "I guess that's you." "That's me," Izuku replies, voice shaky. He takes a few steps along the wall, testing to see if Eraser will stop him. The man doesn't move, and Izuku takes it as a sign. He breaks into a sprint, running from the alleyway as fast as he can. He passes under the flickering street lamp, listening for footsteps behind him, but he doesn't hear any. It's cold outside, and it stings his skin, but not as much as his ribs and thigh ache. He feels like he can still smell that one guy's blood, can still smell the stench of the dumpster, and he runs the entire way home. When he gets back, he hauls himself through the window, adrenaline still pumping through his veins. His heart pounds in his ears as he rips off the goggles and mask, as he tiptoes to the bathroom and turns the shower on the hottest temperature, even though it could wake his mom up. His heart rate doesn't come back to normal until he's standing under the spray, black hair dye washing out and running down his skin in dark rivulets. The bruises forming on his abdomen and thigh are bright red, turning violet in spots. When he sleeps, he dreams of the look on the girl's face when she got away. Izuku is sore the next day, sore in a way that he's only ever been after his worst beatings from his bullies. Oddly enough, the bullying has slowed down since he found out about his quirk, even though none of them know. He wonders how much it has to do with the way Koch-chan is avoiding him. He wonders if they're planning something big. He rolls out of bed, and his stomach feels like it's been branded, poked with a red-hot iron and singed until the bones beneath are burned too. It makes him hiss, taking in air sharply and squeezing his eyes shut to push away the pain. Something about it is satisfying, though. If he'd ignored the situation, wouldn't that girl be in just as much pain or more? "Isn't it better if it's me?" School goes by in a blur. His bullies sneer at him, whisper about him in the halls, but nobody trips him or hits him or confronts him directly. It's easier to ignore when it's like this, when they're barely even bothering him. He's swept away in his head, reliving that fight over and over again. If he had a knife, he could have just cut the ropes. If he had any kind of weapon, really, he'd be able to fight back more effectively. Being functionally immortal doesn't really help if he can't actually fight in the first place, does it? So when school lets out, when it's late afternoon and the sky is a sodden gray with rain spilling out of the clouds and dripping in silver puddles on the sidewalk, Izuku hurries through the damp streets to a store that he knows sells knives. He remembers going there with his mom when one of their kitchen knives had gotten so dull it wouldn't really cut the vegetables right, and this store had whetstones. He remembers staring at the display of utility knives, kitchen knives, and some that were probably mostly for display, seeing as he's pretty sure they're illegal to take in public. By the time he gets to the store, welcome, a woman behind a counter says to him, smiling at him behind square glasses. She sets down a calculator, placing it on top of a piece of paper heavily covered in pencil marks and ink, and she steps out from behind the counter. There's a black apron dusted with some gray and white powders wrapped around her, covering a flowery blouse and a pair of well-worn jeans. She looks like a high schooler, maybe a first-year college student. Is there anything I can help you find? She asks, a polite smile on her lips. She pushes one of her low pigtails back behind her shoulder. Izuku says, eloquently. He's not used to talking to girls, much less pretty ones. I came to get some knives. She tilts her head at him. What kind were you looking for? Izuku swallows. Something I could use for self-defense, he answers, voice quiet. Her smile drops and she nods seriously, like she gets it. Let me show you what we have, she says, gesturing for him to follow as she walks down an aisle of steel shelves. Izuku realizes that the store is mostly hardware and weapons in the first place, and he figures that's why they've only ever gone the one time. He and his mom don't really have use for weapons, and their landlord is good about repairs when things do break. He eyes the plumbing material, looks at how many different shapes of piping and connectors there are, and decides it's for the best that he's never had to mess with it. She stops in front of a board that has display shelves built into it, each shelf holding a number of knives. Izuku recognizes it from years ago, when he'd come here with his mom, but the order of things is all different, and the knives seem smaller. It's intimidating, how many options there are. What kind of budget are you working with? She asks, and Izuku tells her how much money he's willing to spend. She nods, looking over the knives thoughtfully. You'll want something easy to conceal, to carry with you. No point in having a knife for self-defense if it's never there for you to use, right? She reaches up to the shelf and takes down a knife with a blade about as long as Izuku's palm, the handle a little longer than the blade. It's simple, straight, and he watches as she folds the blade easily into the handle. I like this one because it has a good weight to it, she says, voice a mumble, almost like she's not talking to him. It's easy to open, too, and she flicks a button and snaps her wrist, the knife opening easily. She snaps it shut with both hands, then offers it to him. Izuku takes it. Thank you, he says, holding the metal knife in his hand. The handle is black and textured for grip, cold and weighty in his hand. He copies what she did earlier, trying to snap the knife open with a flick of the wrist, but it doesn't open. She chuckles. Sorry. I should have said, it's hard to open it with one hand if you haven't practiced. She rubs a hand on the back of her head, and for the first time Izuku notices a large yellowing bruise on the inside of her wrist. He wonders if she gets bullied, too. Izuku swallows, then opens the knife with both hands. The blade is so shiny that it almost looks soft, and he can see his wavering reflection in it, along with the glowing reflections of the industrial lights above them. The blade snaps into place. The weight of it feels foreign in his hands, but it also feels good. It smells like iron. Oh, and if you get that, you should have some extra cash, she says, and Izuku carefully presses the button and closes the knife, holding it in his palm. He watches as she leans up and takes another knife down from the top shelf. She turns to him, a small smile on her face as she offers him a strange-looking weapon. The handle is shaped like a grip, with grooves for each of his fingers, and the blade sticks out between where his middle and ring fingers would go, a thin, double-sided blade of silvery metal. This one's for punching, she says, her voice picking up excitedly. These are so fun, really, and if you know how to throw a punch you'll be fine using it. She grips it in her hand, showing Izuku the way it fits her fist and sticks out from her fingers, wicked sharp. He wonders, briefly, if it's legal for him to have these. I'll take them both, he says, and she smiles wide at him. Great. I'll get you ringed up, she says, holding out a hand and offering the strange punching knife. He takes it from her gingerly. She turns and walks back to the register, and he follows, glancing at all of the other stuff in the store. They sell bullets, strangely, but not guns, and he sees a lot of mismatched stuff around the place. Like fishing tackle, even though there isn't much fishing around here. It's odd, but certainly not the strangest thing he's seen. When he catches up to her at the register, she's sliding a sheath across the glass counter. For the one that doesn't fold, she says, smiling. This way you don't accidentally cut yourself. Izuku takes it with a shaky nod, and watches as she types things into her calculator, scribbling down notes as she goes. Alright, she says, and gives him the total. He hands over the cash, and she opens the register drawer with a ding, stuffing the bills into their overfull drawers. When he goes home, after he thanks her and walks through the rainy streets of Musatafu, after he takes his damp shoes off and reassures his mom that he wasn't out in the rain for long enough to get sick, he places the knives in pouches on his utility belt. He sits in his room at his desk and Googles how to use knives in combat, how to throw a punch and how to defend himself. He might have a quirk, but he can't rely on it for every situation. Endless tries mean nothing if he loses every time, right? The next time he goes out on the streets, he's more careful. He keeps his hand on his belt, next to his knives, and he walks through the streets more cautiously, looking down alleyways, even if all he hears is talking. It's darker than that night with the 3 men and the girl, because he had to wait until the bruises on his stomach healed enough that he could fight if he needed to, so he could move freely. The moon is a thin slit in the sky, silvery white where it hovers among the stars. Izuku walks through the streets, careful not to let his feet drag against the ground. The city is loud even at night, and he can hear the heavy bass of the music playing in a nearby club. The lights of billboards and open signs paints the streets, still damp from the rain that morning and the morning before that, in a rainbow of bright colors streaking across puddles and reflecting off of the dark ground. Izuku hears the fight before he sees it, just like the last time. It sounds different though, like 2 men growling and shouting at each other, like the sounds of fists meeting flesh. Izuku turns down the street. The sounds are coming from the second he hears it, and he doesn't have to bother hiding himself, because the 2 guys brawling it out in front of a bar aren't even looking. There's blood dripping down one of their noses, running down his already stained white shirt and dropping onto the concrete. The air smells like alcohol and sweat, salty and volatile. Izuku draws his knife, the normal one, and opens it before getting closer. He holds it by his side, hand turned out so the blade catches the light of the bar, the neon pink and bright red lights that decorate the front of the building. He angles the light so it reflects into one of the guy's eye, stopping a few feet from them. "Break it up," he says, trying to make his voice lower than it really is. The guy with the bloody nose pauses, and the guy who isn't bleeding follows suit. They both stare at him, clearly drunk. They're swing. "Who the heck are you?" One of them asks. "Swing." "Doesn't matter," Izuku says. "Stop fighting." He raises the knife, pointing it at them, and it seems to do the trick. The 2 of them glance at each other, and the man with the bloody nose huffs, turning and walking away. The other guy turns and walks back into the bar, slamming the door behind him. Izuku stares for a moment, then turns and walks the opposite direction from where the bloody nose dude went. It's a strange sensation, having people listen to him. He kind of likes it. Studying for the entrance exam is something Izuku saves mostly for the weekends, when he doesn't have school to take up his daytime. He spends his afternoons on the beach cleaning and his evenings sleeping and patrolling the streets, with not a moment to spare for studying or relaxing. So, it's a lazy Sunday morning that finds him hunched over his notebooks at his desk, reviewing his math over and over again. His back aches from sitting too long, and his left arm is bruised from blocking a hit the night before. He's still just breaking up fights and stopping little crimes, nothing crazy and nothing of note, but he keeps managing to get little injuries that annoy him, and make cleaning the beach slow work. Watching self-defense videos and using the knives helps. He hasn't had to cut anyone yet, but they work wonderfully as a deterrent. He shakes his head, forcing himself to refocus on the equation he's trying to figure out. It's been a few months since they went over this, but he can't help but feel stupid for not remembering such a simple concept. He knows this is on the UA entrance exam. According to an online forum he's always on, they include a few topics from each subject in the exam every year, and the rest vary. He wants to make sure that, if nothing else, his written exam is perfect. He knows he's not going to be able to rely on the practical portion, not with his quirk. His vision is blurry, though, and his eyes sting and burn when he blinks. He squeezes his right hand tighter around the pencil, trying to ground himself and get his brain to work already. It doesn't work. He can feel the chair under his legs, the pencil tight in his hand, his nails biting into his palm, but he can't focus on the schoolwork in front of him. He knows, somewhere in his mind, that he's been working for too long, but he also knows he has to overwork himself to get into UA without a useful quirk. He doesn't have a choice. A soft knock on the frame of his door pulls him out of his thoughts, and he turns to see his mom at the open door to his bedroom, a tray in her hands with a glass of ice water, and a steaming bowl of rice. She smiles at him. "Izuku," she says, stepping into his room and setting the tray on his desk. "You didn't eat anything for lunch." He watches a droplet of condensation roll down the surface of the glass. "Thanks, Mom," he says, looking up at her and giving her a huge grin. She smiles wider back at him and gives him a pat on the back. "I know it's important to you to get into UA, but don't forget that your health is important too," she says, glancing down at his notes. "Oh, is this what you're working on?" Izuku nods. "I can't remember how to do it," he admits, his face flaring red. "Oh, well," Inko says, picking up his pen. "I do something similar at work a lot. I can help you, if you want." Izuku nods. "Yes, please." When his mom walks him through the problem, writing her own neat notes next to his and telling him how she uses these for her own job, how she remembers the tricks and equations, it's easier to focus. He gets through the material while he eats warm rice and drinks cold water, and before he knows it, his mom's pulled up a chair, and they're working through all of that weekend's tasks in just a few hours. The last day of middle school is surreal. He sits through the closing ceremony in his uniform, feeling out of place. Feeling old. He doesn't really listen to what anyone giving speeches says, he just sits and waits for it all to be over. High school will be better. There's nowhere to go but up from here, right? When the ceremony ends, he starts to walk home because where else would he go? It's not like he has friends, except maybe Koch-chan. Izuku honestly isn't even sure if Koch-chan counts anymore. He hasn't really spoken to him except for snide comments, not since that day with the sludge villain. In some ways, Izuku is okay with it. He was getting tired of the bullying, of going home and hiding burns from his mom. At least it gave me practice hiding the injuries, he thinks. And pain tolerance. He steps into the tunnel that he'd been attacked in on that fateful day, the shadow of the bridge above casting the walkway in soft gray shade. It's an unseasonably warm day, and it's pleasant to be in the shade, as opposed to miserably cold, as it would normally be this time of year. It's earlier than when they normally get out of school, too, so that could be why. The cherry blossom trees have just started to bloom, and the wind brushes soft pink petals under the bridge in little drifts, almost like tiny snowflakes. Izuku watches them as he walks, drags his feet along and kicks them in front of him. Maybe that's why he doesn't see the kids from his middle school until he literally runs into them. He steps back with a start and looks up in surprise to see 3 of the kids that have bullied him for the past 3 years, kicked him in the hallways, and held him while Koch-chan burned him after school. He bites his lip and takes a step back. Deku, one of the boys, sneers, reaching out to grip his shoulder. It's been a while. And it has. Izuku was starting to think he was free from all this. Izuku pushes the boy's hand off of him with his other hand, stepping back again. They draw closer, though, and he finds himself settling into the fighting stance he's used at night, on the roads and in the alleyways. One of them, his shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, laughs at him. What, are you gonna fight back for once? He shakes his head, turning to look at one of his buddies. Wouldn't it have made sense to do that at the beginning of school instead of the end? Stupid Deku. The other guy starts to laugh, and Izuku isn't entirely sure why he throws a punch at the guy. His head is still turned, but he does. His knuckles crack satisfyingly against his bully's face, and the kid stumbles back, gripping his face with a hand. What the hell? One of the other kids throws a messy punch at him, but it's slow and weak compared to the grown adults Izuku's fought and intimidated the past month. He knocks it away with one hand and elbows the kid in the gut with the other arm. The guy grunts when it makes contact, folding over and gripping his stomach. God, what the heck? One of them asks, but Izuku doesn't waste any time. He pushes past them and runs like he's never really dared to before. He runs and runs, the trees all around him, budding green from the springtime warmth, blurring together with his speed. He runs, and he doesn't stop until he's far past his house, in the part of town that's loud and alive at night, but quiet and sad during the day. He stops in front of a random building, a short, squat thing that has a closed sign in its window, and is clearly some kind of nightclub. He catches his breath with his hands on his knees, gasping and blinking back tears. He feels sick when he thinks about what he's done. He fought back. I'm really gonna get it tomorrow, he thinks before he remembers that today was the last day. I'm free. He laughs. I'm free. And then he drops to the ground, sitting with his knees pulled to his chest and laugh crying to an abandoned street. He's sure he looks like a mess, his uniform messy from sitting in the dirt, and his face surely red and streaked with tears, but he doesn't care. From now on, he doesn't have to deal with those kids and their fists. He doesn't have to deal with the whispers. It'll be better, Yue, he tells himself. It has to be. A couple of nights later, he's in his costume, and he feels so alive. The sounds of nighttime, of muffled music and dancing, leaking through the walls of buildings, of flickering streetlights and quiet arguments, of crickets and cicadas hiding in the grass, they sound like home to him now. He knows this part of town like the back of his hand, knows which bars usually have fights outside them, and which alleyways people like to sell drugs in. He even knows which heroes patrol the area, and it isn't many. He's only seen Eraserhead that one time, and since then he's seen a couple of sidekicks. He supposes the higher-ranking heroes prefer to work in the daytime, when they can get media recognition. It's a quieter night, as far as partying goes. He thinks it's because it's a Wednesday night, and most people who have jobs or school can't be out too late during the weekdays. He's also out a little later than normal. He'd overslept. It's a cloudy night, making it darker than it should be, and the sky is an inky black mess of clouds above him. He wonders if it'll rain. He listens for the sounds of thunder, but all he hears is a shout. He turns his head in the direction it came from, looking through his goggles for any signs of a fight, but he's too far away. He moves carefully down the street, keeping his steps even with the beat of the music from the nearest nightclub. This is the best way to conceal the noise his footsteps make, he's learned. Suddenly, from behind a parked truck with its lights on, 2 projectiles shoot past him, moving so quickly he can't even see what they are. Izuku immediately drops into a fighting stance, his hand pulling his knives from his belt. He flicks open the one that folds, having finally mastered the trick the other day, and he tucks the one he can use for punching into his left hand. He creeps around the truck slowly, walking sideways to keep his body facing where the thread is. He sees a huge beast of a man, easily over 6 feet tall and covered in bristling spines, each about 2 feet in length, and made of thick keratinous material that shines in the light from the headlights of the truck. He's cornering 4 partygoers, a man and 3 women, against a wall. A hedgehog quirk. Izuku thinks, then cringes as the man fires 2 spines forward, pinning the man to the concrete wall behind him. The spines dig deep into the concrete, cracking it with their force. Porcupine, his brain helpfully supplies as the man turns his angry glare to look at Izuku. Izuku remembers what he heard in one of his videos: if your opponent is disposed in ranged combat, get close. So he does, dashing forward and sliding into the porcupine man's personal space. He slashes with the knife in his right hand, but misses, just a few centimeters short. The man growls and swings a fist at Izuku, and for all Izuku sees it coming, he can't dodge in time. The hit to his chest sends him stumbling back, and he barely has enough time to straighten back up before the man shoots a volley of 3 slick dark brown spines at him. Izuku feels a rush of burning pain as they sink into him, one in his right thigh, one in his left calf, and a third at the bottom of his stomach, just above his left hip. He recognizes that he drops to the ground from the way his viewpoint gets lower, but all he can register is the white-hot pain, and the feeling of his insides grating on the spine embedded in his stomach when he gasps for air. He can't feel either of his legs except for the blinding pain, but he does feel when the man kicks him right where the spine is lodged in his belly, knocking it deeper and making Izuku gag from pain, throwing up his mom's cooking and sour acid all over the dirty ground. He tries to pull himself away, crawling on the ground with his gloves soaked through with his own vomit and blood, but he doesn't get very far before his limbs stop responding to his requests. His hands grow weak, tingly, like they're falling asleep, and Izuku registers that he feels very, very cold. He tries to sit up, tries to do anything, but his body doesn't move except for a twitch. His vision is a swirling black, and he dry heaves, his stomach and throat spasming as he loses consciousness. He gasps for breath and stumbles mid-step when he comes back to himself, his body aching for just a moment from phantom pain. He stops in place, staring ahead of him blankly. He's out already, in his costume with his hair dyed and pulled back, and he just died. This street is familiar to him, only a block from where he now knows a villain is waiting with 4 civilians, and a quirk powerful enough to dispose Izuku, before he even got a hit in. The thing is, as much as he planned to die over and over again if he needed to save people, it's different when he's just gone and done it. He has to sit down, wrapping his arms around his knees and drawing in shaky breaths. He can't quite get his heart to settle because all he can think about is the sensation of the villain's quill sinking into his flesh, cutting through muscle and organs. He swallows thickly and tries to push down the bile that rises in the back of his throat. This is his power. This is his quirk. I have no right to be so upset by it. Izuku digs his fingers into his shins, feeling the pressure and the dull pain through his jeans. He focuses on it, lets it ground him. He feels his breath slow, feels his heart rate become steady, and only then he releases his grip on himself. He's still sitting on the ground, but he can think. He tilts his head back, looks up at the sky. The clouds drift lazily ahead, no urgency to them. He breathes, in and out. A single raindrop falls on his cheek, making his nose wrinkle and his eyes shut reflexively. Izuku pulls himself to his feet and swallows his fear, looking back toward where he knows the villain is. Porcupine, he decides to call him, because it's not like he's going to ask the guy for his actual name. Izuku knows now that he's not going to win if he approaches head-on, but he thinks he might be able to sneak up on the man, if he comes from the other side of the truck, where the headlights won't illuminate him quite so much. Maybe if he can get the jump on the guy, if he can knock him out before he has the chance to shoot spines, he'll be able to take Porcupine down before Porcupine disposes him. He knows what to listen for this time as he approaches the truck, sneaking around the back side of it so he can avoid being seen. He hears the thwack from Porcupine pins the man to the wall, then another series of thumps. He grits his teeth and prays that none of the people Porcupine has cornered are hurt as he skirts the back of the truck, looking up over the bed of it to see Porcupine's back. It occurs to him that maybe trying to sneak up behind a villain whose entire back is covered in weapons may not be the best idea. Izuku takes another step, and he sees the 4 civilians from last time, except the man Porcupine had pinned to the wall last time, has a trio of spines embedded in his throat, all clustered together in one terrible wound. Even from this distance, the amount of blood that spilled out from his body, coating his clothing and the ground below in a dark, sticky red, tells Izuku that he's dead. Izuku feels a wave of nausea pass over him, remembering the way it felt when the spines suck into his own flesh, when he grew cold and shaky and died. He swallows, heavy in his throat, because now he has to die, because he isn't going to let someone else die in his place. Their lives are worth more than his, after all, he has so many of them. Izuku pulls out his knife and swallows. Just because he has to do this doesn't mean it isn't going to hurt. He debates trying to sneak closer, first, but then Porcupine flexes and the spine shoots out, just barely grazing the cheek of one of the women. She shrieks and steps back, presses herself against the wall. She and her friends are all white-eyed and pale, huddled together and shaking. Izuku can't wait if it means they'll die. He's throwing his knife at Porcupine before he can let himself think about it, rushing forward at the villain before he can even see if the knife hit or not. He hears a squelching noise as it embeds itself in Porcupine's back, just between 2 spines, and Porcupine shouts in surprise, his back bristling up and the spine scratching Izuku's arms. He doesn't stop though, tugging his punching knife out from his belt and burying it deep in Porcupine's shoulder. Some part of him, as he tugs the knife out of the wound, wants Porcupine to run so he doesn't have to die again, but he pushes down the thought. The stab wound uses red blood, and Izuku goes in for another stab, just as Porcupine's hand wraps itself around his neck, pulling him away from the villain's side, and moving him in front of Porcupine. Izuku struggles, kicking his feet out and feeling satisfaction when his heel knocks into Porcupine's stomach, but it doesn't seem to even faze the villain. Izuku watches the rage flicker in his eyes before he slams Izuku to the ground, his shoulder and head knocking against the concrete, smearing in someone's blood. Izuku isn't sure if it's the dead man's, Porcupine's, or his own. He pushes himself up off of the ground, his head spinning and the light from the truck headlights suddenly seeming brighter and multicolored. He reaches a hand up to his temple and feels a knot already forming, red hot and angry. Porcupine growls from above him and buries his foot in Izuku's stomach, sending Izuku back onto his side on the ground, gasping for breath. The air he breathes in tastes like rotting blood. Izuku shuts his eyes and curls in on himself, praying for Porcupine to just dispose him quickly this time, to stab him somewhere vital and get it over with. He feels another kick, this one to his shins where they're protecting his stomach, then a burst of pain so strong he can't tell where it came from. He's dead in seconds, but it still hurts like a wildfire raging through his veins. The next time he wakes up, he doesn't waste a moment. He starts running the second his eyes open, the concrete pounding under his feet as the city whizzing by. He has to find a hero, a real hero who can actually hecking save those people. He doesn't have enough power to do anything here, not to save the civilians or defeat the villain. All he can do is die, and that doesn't solve anything if it won't save people. He knows he saw Burnin earlier that night, but to his frustration, he can't remember when he saw her exactly where, and he turns down the wrong street over and over again, mistaking the warm lights of a nightclub and a bar, and then a street lamp for her fire. He feels his chest aching from the exertion, feels the muscles in his legs burn from running for so long, but it feels like nothing in comparison to being stabbed through. He finally catches her getting into a car, of all things, and he sees the look of surprise on her face when he rounds the corner, sweaty and exhausted and out of breath. Burning, he gasps. You need to come, he takes in a breath, sees her step out of the car and back onto the asphalt, a confused look on her face. There's a villain, Porcupine Quirk, 4 civilians. He can't get any more out of her, but it seems to be enough because she nods and starts walking, and he takes off running again, even though his lungs try to tell him not to. He hears her footsteps match his pace, sees the flickering light of her quirk illuminating the way as he runs, taking the shortest path to where he knows Porcupine is, but he knows from the sounds of 2 women screaming that he's too late, even before he can see the truck. They're round a corner, and Burning passes him up as he freezes in horror. The man is dead, just like last time, his blood coating the wall. One of the women, a college-aged girl with long blonde hair, is crumpled in a heap between the wall and the truck, her hair streaked with dark blood, and her arm pinned to the ground. There's at least 7 spines sticking out from her that Izuku can't see, and he realizes with horror that she had tried to get away. He covers his mouth with a hand to stifle any noise he makes and turns, running from the scene. He doesn't need to see if Burning wins to know that he has to start over. It's too late. He stumbles to the nearest building with an external fire escape, the metal stairs climbing up the 7 stories. There are lights on in some of the windows, but he doesn't want to wait to find a better option. He has no idea how long until this becomes permanent, until the blood of that man and that poor woman is on his hands. He climbs the stairs 2 at a time, his breath fogging his goggles where it leaks out from his mask. The view from the top is horrible. He can see the fire from where Burning is fighting, can hear the shouts and screams. He looks down and swallows. At least this way, he's dead before he can feel any kind of pain. He shuts his eyes and dives off, head first. Izuku notes that he isn't out of breath anymore when he opens his eyes, and he makes use of that fact, turning on his heels and sprinting. Burning isn't close enough, but that doesn't mean nobody is. There has to be someone close enough, right? There has to be a way for him to save them. Izuku spots a familiar convenience store, the lights inside spilling out through the glass doors and windows, the open signs flashing blue and green. He runs right up to the door and opens it, practically flinging himself inside. The heat of the air is too hot with all the adrenaline rushing through him, and the cashier, an older man with a bald head, looks terrified. Izuku realizes he probably looks a little like a villain. Call the cops, he says, pointing to the phone. 2 blocks north of here, a villain is holding people hostage. The man behind the counter nods quickly and all but rips the phone off the wall, dialing the emergency number into it. Izuku paces along the front of the counter as the man talks quietly into the receiver, too quietly for Izuku to hear. He sees an aisle of candy, an aisle of chips, an aisle of magazines. One has basic supplies like bottles of windshield washer fluid, duct tape, lighter fluid, and tool sets. Izuku sees the lighter fluid and the matches, thinks of Burning last time. The fire quirk is so well suited, too, he thinks. She wouldn't have to worry about his spikes acting as armor. The cashier's voice snaps Izuku out of his thoughts, and he turns to look at him. They said they'd send someone. They'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Izuku asks, staring at the man in horror. He doesn't know how long exactly it took burning to get there last time, but it was certainly less than 20 minutes. He remembers the way the blonde woman was crumpled like a broken toy, the way the man's blood spread across the ground like an oil slick on water. His mouth is suddenly very dry. "Thank you," he hears himself say, distantly. He turns and walks out the door, not really hearing when the cashier shouts after him. He walks, calmer than he feels, through the streets. He doesn't even hear sirens, not even when he scales the fire escape from last time, not when he stands at the top. He stares, distantly, in the direction of where the villain is. He hears a scream, and he jumps. There's already a plan in Izuku's head when he wakes up. He starts back toward the convenience store, drawing his knife and jogging through the streets. He can be nice, can't play by the rules if he wants to save these people. He isn't a hero, and he doesn't have a quirk that can help him fight. All he has is his wits and information. He pushes open the door to the convenience store with this in mind, knowing that that older man will be scared of him from the beginning. He points the knife at the man and doesn't bother to shape his expression. He's wearing a mask after all. He tries not to sound terrified when he says, "Better call the cops." He turns and grabs a bottle of the lighter fluid and a box of matches, stuffing the matches into a pouch on his belt and tucking the lighter fluid under one arm. "I'm robbing you." The man behind the counter takes a step back, sputtering, but Izuku doesn't want to stick around. He lowers the knife and turns to face the man again. "I'm about to set someone on fire, 2 blocks north of here," he says through gritted teeth. "Tell the police to hurry. Burning is on patrol, so they should send her as well. She's used to dealing with fire," he says, turning and yanking the door open before the man can reply. He can hear the bell above the door ding cheerfully as he sprints out. He folds his knife shut and shoves it in his pocket as he runs down the streets. He won't need it for his plan. The trip to the truck and to the fight seems to take longer than normal, and Izuku pushes himself, his calves burning. He needs to start working out more on his own. He should be able to run faster. He slows to a quick walk when he sees the truck and sneaks around the back, moving his shoes carefully along the ground like he did the second time. He listens, doesn't hear any screams, just whimpers, and he prays that means nobody is dead yet. He came faster than the first time, even, so they should still be alive. As he rounds the truck, he sees Porcupine, backlit by his headlights and just as huge as ever. Izuku unscrews the cap on the jug of lighter fluid, a bright red container probably about 1 pint in volume. It'll have to be enough. He steps as close as he dares to, then darts forward and dumps the bottle over Porcupine's hunched back. The air smells like kerosene, sharp and chemical, as the villain shouts in surprise and turns. Izuku barely dodges the open palm strike Porcupine sends at him, and he shoves his hand into his belt pocket, pulling out the box of matches. His hands shake as he rips open the box, backing away from Porcupine, who's stalking toward him with anger in his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he growls, and Izuku strikes a match, the fire a bright golden beacon in the dark night. Izuku sees the firelight dance over Porcupine's face, showing more of the man's features than he's ever gotten to see before. He's ugly, middle-aged and twisted up with such anger that it makes him look nothing but cruel. Izuku grits his teeth and steps towards him with the match. "I'm the one who's going to stop you from disposing those people," he says, swiping at Porcupine with the match, the flame flickering as it rushes through the air. Porcupine flinches back, the match just barely missing a damp spine, dripping with yellow-tinted fluid that glitters, reflecting the light of the match. "I'd like to see you try, brat," he says, stepping back and throwing a kick at Izuku. Izuku sees it coming and dodges, stepping back neatly. It's a lot easier to dodge when you're not already injured, he thinks idly. He realizes that he's in range of the spines like this, and he slides forward and out of the way, just as Porcupine fires 3 dark spines from his shoulder. Izuku notices that, like the past few times, he doesn't throw a kick or punch at the same time, even though Izuku is close enough to do it. He wonders if Porcupine even can throw a hit while he's firing. He swipes the lit match at Porcupine, and feels a contact of spine on the back of the man's arm. Fear flares in the man's eyes for the first time, and Izuku feels a rush of satisfaction, as the man fires the flaming quill in a panic, the fiery thing shooting out into the night. Izuku thinks he might hear sirens, but he doesn't let it distract him. He steps in, grabbing the man's forearm while he's mid-shot, and holding the match just above the bare skin of his chest, where he's glistening with the lighter fluid that drips down his skin. Porcupine freezes like a statue, his pupils tiny specks, and in his heart beating so hard Izuku can feel his pulse in his arm, even through the gloves Izuku wears. "Don't move," Izuku says, making eye contact with Porcupine, even though he knows his goggles hide where he's looking. "Or I'll dispose you." Porcupine just stares at him, his throat bobbing as he swallows. Izuku watches a bead of sweat run down his neck. The flame of the match twitches, and Izuku sees the way Porcupine's gaze darts over to it. He feels strange, like he's someone else entirely, but he doesn't have it in him to care. 2 people would be dead by now if he wasn't doing this. 2 innocent people, who don't get second chances like he does. He tightens his grip on Porcupine's wrist. He's sure, now, that he hears sirens. They're loud, and he hears quick footsteps too. He doesn't dare to turn his head, doesn't dare to look away in case Porcupine tries something, but he hears a voice that he'd only heard screaming before. "He saved us." A female voice shouts, and from the corner of his eyes he can see a blur of blonde hair, pointing to him. "The guy with the spike said he was gonna dispose us, but he showed up out of nowhere, right?" Burning's voice startles Izuku just a tiny bit, and he darts a quick glance over to see her only about 10 feet from where Izuku holds Porcupine. He steps back, quickly moving to put distance between him and the villain. "He's got lighter fluid on him," Izuku says, cursing his stutter. "So, if he tries anything," he swallows, watching as the pro-hero looks at him and then Porcupine. "Okay," she says, and Izuku sees the flash of red and blue police sirens, the shriek of them drowning out what Burning says next, but he supposes it doesn't really matter. He needs to run. He drops the match and steps on it, smothering it under his boot, then turns and sprints away, praying that they prioritize the villain over the vigilante. He knows what happens when you do this kind of thing and you're not licensed. They stop you at best, treat you like a villain at worst. He runs through the night, not for the first time, but it feels different in this situation. The air in his lungs feels like a celebration, and he resists the urge to whoop and cheer as he skips down the streets of Nusatafu. Sure, he'd died, but more importantly, those civilians hadn't. As he enters his own neighborhood, the sounds of sirens distant and barely audible behind him, he lets himself slow to a walk. He feels the night breeze brushing against his sweaty skin, and he lets himself smile. That, he thinks, is why I want to be a hero. He isn't even sore the next morning when he opens his eyes sleepily, light spilling through a gap in his curtains and falling on his face. It's a strange feeling, to wake up and have it be in the warmth of his bed instead of on that street. He fumbles a hand on his side table until it finds his phone, which he tugs free of the charging cable and holds in front of his face. Like usual, he opens his Hero News app. He doesn't have any friends to text, so it's always been this and the Quirk analysis and pro-hero fan forums. The app is simple in theme, and it's usually dominated by articles on All Might and the rest of the top 10, so he's a little surprised to see that the top few articles all seem to be about someone he's never even heard of. The first article, Boy in Red Saves 4, doesn't ring any bells, neither does the second, New Hero or New Villain. Mass Fighter aids in capture, but it all suddenly makes horrible sense when he reads the third title, Vigilante threatens murder to attract heroes, results in successful rescue of 4. Izuku clicks on one of them and reads through it with a sense of sickness building in his stomach. The thing is, he never thought he'd get recognized as a vigilante. He'd always just assumed that he'd be a famous hero, and his nighttime identity would be something only underground heroes and cops knew about, but this... He doesn't remember to breathe for a second as he reads through the descriptions of himself. There's no pictures of him, just of Burning and Porcupine, who actually is apparently known as Impaler. Fitting. But it's still unnerving to read article after the suspected college student that robbed his store to save lives. The media seems unsure about his status, if he's a villain getting vengeance or a new vigilante or even a new pro that avoided the limelight, but reading the speculation, both eases his nerves and makes him feel sick. They think he's older than he is for one, but they can tell he isn't full grown. They think he has either an analysis quirk or one that would have made him invulnerable to the fire he threatened Porcupine Impaler with. After all, why else would he risk that? He'd surely have burned up too if he'd lit the villain up at such close range. The worst part, he thinks, is that so many of them think he's a villain. They cite the way he threatened the shopkeeper with a knife, the way he stole, and the way he would have disposed the villain, not just captured him. They speculate that Izuku wanted to steal the other villain's thunder, that he wanted to make a name for himself. That if he wanted to help, he would have been better off waiting for the pros to arrive. That makes him feel nauseous with frustration, his eyes pricking with angry tears because they don't get it. He didn't make an educated guess and get it right on the first try. He didn't take the risky route for fun. He tried everything else, tried getting a hero and tried calling the cops, and tried to handle it with knives and not stolen flames. He knows he saved 4 people, and the majority of the articles agree, calling him a vigilante and not a villain, but it still makes his heart ache to see those few that insist on him being evil, being dangerous. It makes him want to curl up in a corner and die, makes him want to throw himself off of a building, so his skull gets crushed into pieces on the sidewalk below. He settles for scratching at his arm as he reads, using the raw sensation of nails on skin to ground himself as he reads. He knows he should set his phone down or do something else, but it's a sick fascination that keeps him reading. He thinks that next time, he'll do better. He'll save people and do it in a way that doesn't leave people wondering. They'll know, without a shred of a doubt, that he's a force for good. Izuku hopes it doesn't look suspicious when he goes back to the store he bought the knives from the day after he beats Porcupine, with the articles all talking about him and describing him. He knows, rationally, that he looks nothing like his vigilante self, but knowing that doesn't stop him from feeling anxious as he slips into the shop in the early afternoon, the sun bright and high in the sky. The same lady from last time is behind the counter, and he greets her with a shy wave when he walks in. She smiles brightly at him, pushing her glasses up on her nose and standing up from her stool. "Hey, how are those knives working for you?" she asks, straightening her apron and walking out from behind the glass counter. The great Izuku answers, then wonders if that's a weird thing to say. Should he have said he hadn't gotten to use them yet? Great. The girl replies, flashing him a double thumbs up and a smile so wide it crinkles her eyes shut. I'm Sumaira Miura, by the way. Nice to meet you, Izuku replies, blinking. Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you too, Midoriya. Miura puts her hands on her hips and gives him an appraising look. Now, what can I help you with today? Izuku swallows. I need something loud. In case I'm in trouble and need to get people's attention fast. He picks at his cuticle as he talks, hoping it wouldn't raise any red flags for him to be asking about this. He doesn't want to get caught so early in his career as a vigilante, although he supposes he could dispose himself and redo this conversation if it goes poorly. Miura tilts her head, thinking. I bet you want something really loud, right? The best thing we have for that is air horns, I think. She turns, walking along the aisles, and Izuku scrambles to follow her. She leads him right past the knife aisle, stopping at an aisle filled with various cans of sprayable stuff. He sees spray paints, canned air, wheel lubricant, a lot of things, even some with labels in other languages. He wonders, not for the first time, who exactly the target audience of this store is. Teenage vigilantes, apparently. He's distracted from his thoughts by Miura holding out a white can with a red horn attached to the top. Here. She says, gesturing at a few other air horns on the shelf with her free hand. We've only got the one brand, but I imagine they all work the same. Thank you, Izuku squeaks out, taking the offered air horn. It matches my costume colors, he thinks distantly, then looks up at Miura. Anything else? She asks, and Izuku can't help but glance at her wrist, trying to see if the bruise is still there, or if there are new ones. He can't see anything under her long-sleeved shirt, though. No, he says, smiling. Just this. His mom scolds him later when he tests the air horn in his room, but it's worth it if it means he can get heroes to a scene more quickly. It's a cool Tuesday morning the week before the written portion of the entrance exam, and Izuku's in his room reading the news. The stories about him have died down, mostly, with only a couple of articles mentioning that he'd been spotted around town. He's been more reluctant to go out as well, which has probably helped with getting him off of the media's radar, so to speak. The time he'd normally have been out on the streets had been spent sleeping or studying these past few days, and he's feeling much more confident for it. It's amazing how much easier it is to study when I'm not up all night, he thinks, laughing a little to himself. The trending news topic, though, makes his mood drop quicker than he thought possible. 7-year-old girl kidnapped outside family home retreats. When he opens the article, he sees pictures, too, and that's the worst part of it. The girl is tiny, so small he wouldn't have guessed she could be old enough to have a quirk, much less 7 years old. The picture at the top of the article is just a school photo of her, a shy-looking kid with messy brown hair that's cut in a bob just below her jaw. She has giant blue eyes and tan skin, a tiny scar, or is it a freckle, under her nose. Her smile takes up most of her face, and Izuku tries to remember that as he scrolls through the next couple of paragraphs to look at the next image. It's grainy, clearly a cell phone picture, but it shows that same girl wearing bright blue pajamas. Izuku can't see her face, but her arm is gripped at the wrist, held above her head by a man who looks to be in his 20s, with pale green, shoulder-length hair pulled away from his face. He's got a mask covering any of his features, the latex, skin-tight kind you have to glue on, but Izuku can't see the grimace on his face, and the reflection of the camera flash in his eyes. He's got one hand outstretched, pointing to the right of wherever the person taking the picture was, and there's a halo of white light emanating from his palm. Izuku looks through the article and finds that the man is apparently a known criminal, a notorious kidnapper and robber with a teleportation quirk that works by making pairs of temporary portals. He's wearing a suit in the picture, a well-filled black suit that shows a red tie at his chest, and the article confirms he's thought to be a part of an organized crime syndicate. Frustratingly, if the authorities know anything about his group or their plans, they haven't told the media. The article also notes the girl's quirk, and the comment section below speculates that she must have been abducted for another reason, since it's not something desirable enough to get her kidnapped for that alone. She has a mild empathy quirk, one that lets her sense the emotions of people she's in physical contact with. Reading it makes Izuku wince because she definitely have felt whatever her abductor was feeling when he took her, evading the police until he disappeared, according to the article. He hopes, stupidly, that she'd get rescued soon, then remembers what he's just read. They don't know her abductor's name, base of operations, or affiliation. They don't know anything. And then it occurs to him, the realization sinking into his bones like ice water dumped over his head. The article doesn't say the address she was taken from or the route the villain took, but it does show the picture, and Izuku recognizes that spot. It's not part of his usual route for patrol, but it's on his way home. It's close enough that maybe if he disposed himself and got lucky enough to reset to the night before, he might be able to save her. He might be able to get information, at the very least. Might be able to help. He sets his phone down and gets out of bed like normal. Tugs on a pair of sweatpants over his boxers. Runs a hand through his hair. Walks to the bathroom and stares at his face in the mirror. How do I want to do this? The thing about jumping off of buildings is that it's very convenient when he's already outside, and not so much when he's at home. He could just go for a walk, he supposes. His mom's at work, so she won't notice anything either way. He thinks that maybe, he needs to come up with a plan for how to quickly dispose himself, if he needs to reset himself. A backup plan, in a variety of circumstances. The thought pings a memory in the back of his head, when he'd read online that having a plan was a bad sign, as far as being suicidal goes. He pushes the thought away. It doesn't count, right? It's not like he's actually disposing himself, not like it actually hurts him. He steps back into his room and kneels by his bed, pulling out the box he keeps his costume and vigilante gear in. His knees dig into the floor as he rifles through the box, pulling his utility belt out from where it rests at the very bottom. It looks odd in the morning light, brighter than it should. Izuku realizes that he only ever really sees it in dim light, normally. He pulls out the folding knife, knowing that the blade is still wicked sharp where it sits tucked into the handle. He can even see a hint of silver through gaps in the handle, and he holds it in his palm as he straightens up, nudging the box back under his bed with his foot. He feels the heat from his hand slowly warming the handle of the knife, and he walks back into the bathroom slower than he normally would. He turns on the hot water for the bathtub and reaches his free hand to plug the drain. The sound of the water is loud in his ears as he uses his bare foot to drop the lid of the toilet, then sits on the lid and watches the tub slowly fill. If he's going to do this, he might as well enjoy it. It's just practice, he justifies to himself, the thought seeming hollow even to him. Tall buildings won't always be an option. I should be able to do it this way, too. He doesn't let himself consider the way a shiver runs up his spine when he thinks about that blade, wicked sharp and smooth and clean, digging into the soft flesh of his forearms. He doesn't let himself think too hard about the fact that he's dreamed about doing this, whispers of bloody bathtubs and sharp blades bouncing around in his dreams. Not nightmares, even. Izuku wonders what it says about him that he's been looking forward to trying this, a little. Well, he thinks. Most people don't get to do this without it disposing them. It's only natural that I'm curious. He sets the knife down carefully on the edge of the tub, then pulls off his clothes, shivering at the air on his bare skin. When he steps one foot in the tub, it's a little too hot, but he ignores it, reaching to turn off the tap instead. He lowers himself into the water, hissing at the sting of it. He can see his skin turning red, just a little. It's not burning him, not scalding him, just uncomfortable for a moment before he adjusts. When he does adjust, though, leaning back and resting his head on the tile behind him, the water lapping up around his ears, it feels nice. He feels his muscles relax at the heat, muscles he hadn't had just a few months ago. It's nice to see his progress, laid out in front of him. Izuku figures there's no sense in delaying. He might lose his nerve if he waits, as stupid as that is. It's just a little pain. It won't dispose him. When it's over, he won't even have a scar. He flicks the knife open, the clicking sound it makes echoing in the bathroom, mingling with the soft noises of the water rippling in the tub. The blade reflects light off of it, onto the water, and the water reflects it back up to the blade, making a mesmerizing pattern of silvery ripples. He watches it for a moment, then twists the knife, so it reflects the green of his eyes instead. He sees the glint of emerald, the dark smear that must be his eyelashes. He blinks. He stretches his left arm out in front of him, resting so the belly of his arm is just above the water, and the back of it is just touching the surface. The heat rises in the form of steam around it. Izuku rests the blade of the knife on his arm, just below the crease where his wrist meets his hand, along the blue-green veins that show through the skin there. The metal is cool, and when he digs it into his skin, pulling down and pressing, he can't help but hiss in pain. The line he cuts in his forearm, deep and vertical and clean, fills quickly with blood, rivulets of it rolling off of his forearm and into the water, turning it a rusty red. It doesn't hurt like getting impaled does, like getting explosions set off on your skin or getting kicked in the gut does, but it still makes Izuku a little lightheaded. He knows better than to wait though, and he transfers the blade to his injured hand, and repeats the motion on his right arm. This line is less even, less neat, but he manages to get deeper, probably because he's shaking. He must have hit something important, because where the blood ran smoothly out of his left arm, it pulses out of his one in a thick gushing stream. Izuku drops the knife, not entirely on purpose, and it sinks harmlessly through the water to land on his stomach. He tries to pick it back up, but his arms won't listen to the command, and he just sighs, leaning back in the water, and letting his arms sink under the now dark surface. He doesn't feel cold like he did last time he bled out, just warm and hazy and calm. It's intoxicating, like the burn of his muscles after a workout, that feeling of peace and exhaustion that soaks into his bones. He lets his eyes slide shut, and he thinks this isn't such a bad way to die after all. He wakes up in his bed, and his first thought is that he didn't reset back far enough. He sits up, biting his lip in frustration, then blinks in the darkness and realizes it's not morning. His phone is on his nightstand, and when he grabs it to check the time, the alarm he has set for his patrol goes off, buzzing in his hand. He shuts it off quickly, and takes a deep breath. He knows what he has to do. He tugs out that same box from under his bed, and starts getting into costume as fast as he can. He curses his need for hair dye when it comes to that step, when he's slicking the black gel into his green hair and pulling it back into his ponytail. His hair's gotten longer since he started this, and it's easier to pull back. He wipes his hands off with tissue and pulls the gloves on, ignoring the nasty stickiness still on his palms. He can wash his hands after he saved that girl's life. He's still putting on his utility belt when he hops out the window, breaking into a sprint without bothering to shut it behind him. He doesn't know the exact time the villain was seen, and he doesn't want to waste any time. His quirk thus far has been predictable in that it'll send him back to the same place, over and over again, until he's well past what's been disposing him. He still has no idea how it picks when to send him back to initially, but he has started to suspect it has to do with the point in time he registers mentally as safe. There will be time for analysis later, he thinks, skidding around the corner and biting his lip under his mask. He sees the villain just like in the papers, except the image isn't grainy, and the villain isn't still. He whips his head around upon hearing Izuku slide around the corner, and his mask doesn't hide the grimace on his face. He's clutching the kidnapped girl who looks terrified, her face painted eyes wide with horror. The villain holds up a glowing hand, and the ground falls out from under Izuku's feet. Izuku blinks, disoriented as he pops out of a glowing white portal, shooting feet first out of the side of a building about 100 feet from where he'd been. The villain is running up ahead, and Izuku curses mentally as he hops to his feet and starts to run after him. He watches the villain's hands, sees the way they clearly take time to charge up. The light that's gathering around his palms is dim, but quickly growing, and Izuku's catching up to him now. The girl he's dragging behind him is slowing him down. Izuku realizes that the villain is running strangely, headed straight towards a brick wall, and not along the road like would make sense, and it clicks as Izuku watches the villain lift both hands. He points his right palm at the wall and a shimmering membrane of light flickers, swirling multicolored on the wall. Without slowing down, he twists and angles his other hand, a similar-looking portal manifesting on a building wall much further down the street. Izuku hisses in frustration as the villain steps into one portal and out the other one. He's behind now, the gap he'd been closing now wider than before, and it makes a lot of sense that nobody could catch this guy. This environment is perfect for him, with walls and buildings everywhere for him to throw his quirk at and propel himself forward. He was selected for this, Izuku thinks, because he's perfectly suited to make this work. Izuku realizes that this means that he has very little chance of succeeding first try, but he's going to try. He takes off toward the villain and the girl again, pulling out his air horn and holding one gloved finger over the button. He waits, watches as the villain's palms glow bright and brighter, but Izuku doesn't press the button until the villain raises his hands up to shoot. The air horn is loud as Izuku hoped, and even though he's still a bit behind the villain, it makes him flinch just as his quirk fires. One of the portals hits the ground next to the villain, and the other seems to hit the metal scaffolding on a halfway constructed building, fizzling out and disappearing into nothingness. The portal on the ground flickers out and dies like a light bulb that's run out of power, and Izuku feels himself grinning under his mask, because that means that the villain needs an even surface, 2 even surfaces for his quirk to work. Izuku keeps running at the villain and the girl, even when the villain stops trying to get away and whips around to face Izuku instead. Izuku drops the air horn, fumbling with his belt and pulling out the knife he used to dispose himself. Maybe it's that thought that distracts him, makes him miss the moment the green-haired villain pulls out a pistol, but Izuku only registers the weapon when it's pointed at him. The villain doesn't hesitate, and Izuku is still running when he bananas the gun and shoots. The bullet hits Izuku in the neck, and it only burns for a second before he hits the ground, dead. When Izuku wakes up for his next try, he formulates a plan while he puts on his costume, moving through the motions on muscle memory alone. He knows that to counteract a quirk like the villain's, he'll need to get the other man into an open space, somewhere he can't reasonably use his quirk to escape. He also knows that the villain is armed, likely with more than just the one gun at that. Izuku also, thankfully, knows the direction he's going, and when he'll be at each spot, at least for the brief distance he was in pursuit of the villain. It's also telling that he didn't try to take the girl hostage, Izuku thinks, and he wonders if that was just the villain's style, or if he thought Izuku wouldn't care. Izuku doesn't know, but he thinks the villain would have, if he was ever going to. Maybe. Izuku really should get a burner phone. He tugs on his gloves and snaps on his utility belt as he thinks about it, about how if he could anonymously contact the pros about this, he could get them this information perhaps even quicker than he will on foot. It's not something that'll help him right now, though, and Izuku hops out the window and takes off running, this time headed slightly more east than last time. He doesn't want to catch the villain behind, because then he'll just be chasing after him. No, he wants to force the villain to change direction, to get off course. And Izuku thinks he knows just how to do that. It's also convenient that this route takes him right past the store he'd robbed to help defeat Porcupine. Izuku doesn't even bother going inside, just runs up to the glass door and bangs on it, squinting at the light, a stark contrast to the dim evening. He sees the shopkeeper, the same one as last time, pale from when he stands behind the counter, and Izuku holds his thumb and pinky to his ear in the universal sign for a phone call. The man doesn't seem to have any reservations. He picks up the phone. Izuku doesn't wait around to watch, instead taking off back down the road. Hopefully, knowing to expect him will help avoid him getting shot by cops. Izuku feels his mask move with his breath as he runs, the cool air of the night doing nothing to stop him from sweating as he runs across the streets. There's a couple of people out, even though it's so late, and he sees people stop and stare at him as he races through the city. He stops at a street corner that he knows is in the villain's path, and he draws his knives, positioning himself in the northeast corner of the intersection, hopefully to block the villain from going either of those directions. If Izuku's hunch is right, the villain will prioritize losing his tail than taking the fastest possible route. He'll be willing to turn south instead of continuing to run eastward, and that's how Izuku will get him. Just south of this intersection is a large parking lot, rimmed on all sides with hedges and not walls, hopefully not smooth enough for the villain's quirk to work. If Izuku follows him, blocks the way he came from, he should be able to catch up before the villain gets out of the area. Izuku just has to hope that the heroes and pros that are surely on the villain's trail get there before the villain can get very far. He hears the villain before he sees him, and Izuku watches him step out of a portal, still dragging that poor kid with him. She seems to be resisting, which is different from last time, but then again, Izuku had seen her earlier on last time. She's digging her heels into the ground despite only having on socks, and Izuku bites his lip in sympathy as he sees the villain tug at her sharply, dragging her across the rough ground. He can't help but be glad, though. This will make things easier for him. "Hey, portals!" Izuku shouts, and the villain's head whips around to look at him, his green hair coming loose in thin mint-colored strands. What, surprised to see someone here. Izuku takes a step forward, swipes at the air with his pocket knife, and raises his left fist with his punching knife, prepared to throw a hit if he needs to. "Who are you?" the villain asks, pulling the girl behind him, and oh, that's strange. Is he under orders to keep her alive? It makes sense, considering he abducted her and didn't murder her. "Why don't you come over here and find out?" he says, trying to channel his inner Koch-chan, but mentally crossing his fingers that this bluff will pan out. The villain glances over him, like he's sizing him up, his hazel eyes flashing in the darkness, and sure enough, he turns and fires a portal on the nearest wall and another down the road, on a building to the south. Izuku grins, knowing it's impossible to see with his mask and goggles, and starts to run after them. Right when he steps into the parking lot, he hears sirens and he thinks yes. Because it means he just needs to delay the villain long enough for the authorities to get here. The villain stops about 20 feet into the parking lot and whips around to face Izuku, his face twisted in frustration. "How the hell did you know where I was?" he demands, once again shoving the girl behind him. She pulls back against his grip on her arm, and without even looking down at her, he knees her in the stomach, sending her spluttering. She drops like a sack of brick, the villain's arm the only thing holding her up. Izuku clenches his jaw and takes a step forward. The parking lot is mostly deserted, all empty, flat asphalt. The only cars are in the other end of it, close to a building that still has lights on. The street lights that illuminate the area spill pools of yellow light onto the black ground. "Same way I know how your quirk works," Izuku says, and then takes a gamble. "And how I know who you work for." Izuku watches the man's eyes widen, stretching his mask, as he steps back in clear fear. Izuku is just glad the man didn't question the claim, that he believed such a bold lie. The villain reaches for his belt, but this time Izuku knows what to expect. He runs forward and just like he's seen in self-defense videos, he strikes the underside of the man's wrist with the back of his hand, before the man can get the gun all the way up. It's a risky move, but as the gun clatters to the ground without firing, skidding across the asphalt and stopping a good ways away, Izuku's glad he's read up on how guns work. There's no way the villain would be running around with a gun that was both loaded and had the safety off, not if he didn't want to get his own foot shot by mistake. Heck. The villain swears, and Izuku sees him point both hands at the ground. Izuku slides to the side, reaching for the air horn on his belt, and presses the button without even taking it off his belt. Like last time, it startles the villain, but that wasn't what Izuku was going for, anyway. The sounds of sirens, shrill and anxious in the night, have gotten closer, but Izuku figures the pros tend to be a few moments ahead of the cops in situations like these. Hopefully, close enough to hear the air horn if not the sounds of the fight. Izuku winces as the villain throws a neat kick at him, and he just barely blocks it with the raised arm. He stumbles a step back though, and he realizes with horror that he's stepped into a portal. He curses mentally as he feels himself falling one way, then reversing directions and landing on his head on the ground, just as the portal dissipates from where it was. The ground is hard and unyielding, and even though Izuku doesn't think the total distance he fell could be more than his height, it still knocks him hard enough for his head to spin. He tries to ignore it as he gets to his feet, shaking his head to dispel the fuzzy sensation at the edges of his senses. The villain hasn't gotten far, thankfully, and Izuku charges after him, knives still in hand. He slashes quickly, then throws a punch that barely grazes the villain, just swishing harmlessly through his suit jacket. The slash, though, cuts right through, red leaking from the villain's shoulder and staining his white undershirt quickly. Izuku moves in for another hit, but the villain is expecting it, apparently. He gets Izuku in the jaw with a well-timed elbow, and it sends Izuku right back to the ground. He blinks, stars swirling in his vision, then whips his head over to the villain just in time to see the man raise his hands, one pointed under Izuku and another on the ground, further away from the villain, and the girl still half collapsed behind him. Izuku braces himself, then blinks in surprise as the light on the villain's palm disappears suddenly. The villain's face mirrors Izuku's own shock, and Izuku turns to look behind himself, at the entrance to the parking lot. He sees the swirling cloth first, then the golden goggles, the black hair floating in midair as if it was underwater. Izuku feels a wave of relief. Eraserhead is here. Step away from the kid, Eraserhead says, his capture weapon coming out to surround the green-eyed villain, who takes a step back, his eyes wide with fear. He glances behind him, at the girl, and drops her wrist. She shoots up, running away from the villain and at Izuku, her blue pajamas torn and filthy. She all but throws herself at Izuku, and Izuku drops the knives and raises his hands to catch her, and she launches herself at him where he sits on the ground. Izuku holds her tight when he hears soft sobs, and, remembering her quirk, he tries to think as hard as he can that it's going to be okay, and that you're safe now. I've got you. He can't tell if he works, but he looks up and watches as Eraserhead's capture weapon wraps itself around the villain. The scarf catches the light of the street lamps in a way that makes Izuku dizzy, and oh, he realizes, I have a head injury. He blinks, trying to dispel the queasiness that he suddenly feels. He hears the sounds of tires scraping the ground and looks behind him to see a police motorcycle pulling into the parking lot and stopping about 10 feet away. The cop hops off of his bike and tugs off his helmet, dropping it to the ground, and then jogging over to where Eraserhead is standing by the villain. The officer holds up a pair of quirk-suppressing handcuffs and says something to Eraserhead that Izuku can't understand. Eraserhead nods, watching as the police officer snaps the handcuffs on the green-haired villain, then retracting his capture weapon and wrapping it back around his neck. Eraser turns to look at Izuku where he and the kid are sitting, with Izuku's butt on the ground and the girl on top of his legs, his hands resting on her back. Izuku tightens his grip on her, even though he knows Eraserhead is here to help her. He can't help the fear that runs through him, considering Eraserhead is likely the only person who could dispose him for real without using drugs or handcuffs. You again, Eraserhead says, walking up to them and standing, looking down at Izuku through his goggles. They're close enough that Izuku can see the man's eyes through the gold bars, which is why he sees the exact moment his eyes shift to crimson red, even before his hair starts to lift. Izuku flinches hard, and he squeezes his eyes shut like that'll stop it if Eraser tries to hurt him. Relax, Eraserhead sighs, and Izuku doesn't quite obey, but he does open his eyes. I'm not going to arrest you for saving her life, he says, gesturing to the girl still shaking in Izuku's arms. I do need you to help me take her back to the police station, though, seeing as she seems to like you. Save me, the girl whispers, into his collarbone, and from the way Eraserhead tilts his head, Izuku knows he hears it too. He saved me. Eraserhead sighs, and offers a hand. Look, as much as you're technically a criminal yourself, I don't particularly feel like arresting you right now. We'll go back to the station, you'll answer a few questions about him. Eraser jerks his other hand back, pointing a thumb at where the villain is being loaded into a police car. And you can be on your way. Izuku hesitates, then nods, hating the way his surroundings get fuzzy when he does that. He wonders, briefly, if this is a bad idea, and takes the hand Eraserhead is offering him. The ride back to the station is quiet, and Shota has to keep glancing into the rearview mirror to be sure that the vigilante and the girl he'd rescued were still there. It's impossible to get a read on the boy, with his reflective goggles and black mask, covering everything except his eyebrows and thin strip of skin under his eyes, but Shota can tell he's looking out the window, as they drive from the way his head is facing. There's a dark bruise on the kid's jaw, a red splotch that stretches under his mask, and looks to have started swelling already. That, combined with the unsteady movements and the lack of a fight, makes Shota suspect that the vigilante's got a concussion at the very least. He'd only gotten there right at the end of the fight, so there could be many more injuries that he doesn't know about. He'll have to try and talk the kid into at least getting checked out by medical staff, but something tells him it won't work. He's also starting to seriously doubt the age estimate the police had for him. The guy was short and skinny, but that alone could mean anything. The thing that gets Shota is the way the kid's face is clearly still soft with baby fat, the way he talks like he's not used to seeing heroes up close. Shota thinks he's a high schooler at the oldest, and the thought makes his head hurt. When the police car pulls to a stop in front of the station, the victim's parents are already waiting outside, two women in their early 40s clutching each other tight. They run at the car as soon as they spot their daughter, and the girl herself is opening the door and running into their arms before the officer that had been waiting with her parents can open the door for her. She'd still need a full medical evaluation, but from what Shota heard on the scene, she'd be okay to go home after the report was filed. Shota sighs. Time for his job. He glances at the officer who'd driven them here and nods at him. The young officer gives him a smile in return and slips out of the car, leaving Shota and the teenage vigilante alone. Hey, Shota says, you awake? The kid turns to face him, and Shota can tell he's exhausted even with the disguise on. Yeah, he answers, barely a whisper. If we take you into the police station proper, we're legally required to arrest you, Shota explains. So I'm going to ask you a few questions in the car, then I'll drive you to a hospital. I don't need a hospital, the kid replies, tugging at the collar of his long-sleeved shirt where it sticks out above his hoodie. You have a concussion, Shota says, then continues without missing a beat. What's your name? I'm not going to. Your vigilante name. Shota cuts him off, resisting the urge to smile. Though the kid seems dumbfounded, oddly enough. You can call me Ace, he replies eventually, voice still quiet but not stuttering, at least. Shota nods. How did you know about the ongoing abduction? Ace stares at him for a moment. At least, that's what Shota's assuming is going on under the goggles. It's part of my quirk, he replies, shifting in his seat. He's still wearing his seatbelt, and his red hoodie stands out against the black upholstery. Which is? Shota asks, because having more information on vigilantes is never a bad idea. They never seem to stay vigilantes for long, either getting caught or going rogue. Foresight. Ace's head tilts down, and Shota thinks he's staring at his lap. Interesting. It's not analysis like some had been speculating. I see, Shota replies. Do you have any information on the villain? He has a portal quirk, the kid says, but I'm sure you already knew that. He didn't want the girl to get hurt, so his orders were probably to keep her alive, but he didn't. Ace clears his throat. He wouldn't hesitate to shoot me, if he got the chance, so, the girl was what was important, not just having no casualties. He also seemed afraid when I told him I knew who he works for. Shota arches an eyebrow at that. Do you? Ace shakes his head, then winces, holding a hand to his swollen jaw. No. I just bluffed, and I guess he bought it. I see, Shota answers. Well, is there anything else you know? No, the kid replies, seeming almost upset that he doesn't. I can drive you to the hospital, Shota offers, but he knows even before Ace reaches down and clicks the seatbelt release button, that the answer will be no. I'm okay, thank you. Ace says, fumbling with the doorknob, then pushing the door open. For not arresting me. Shota sighs, shaking his head as Ace steps out of the car and starts to run away, like he thought Shota would change his mind at that point. He hopes that he gets his head checked out. He has a feeling he'll be seeing a lot more of him. When Izuku wakes up the next morning, it's to his mom's hands gently shaking his shoulder. He cracks one eye open, confused to see her hovering over him, worried. Doesn't she have work? Izuku? She says softly, and she sounds so worried. Izuku sits up at that, only to immediately regret it as his bedroom starts to spin and twist around him. He's overwhelmed with a wave of nausea, and the only warning he manages to give his mom is a choking noise before he's leaning over the side of his bed and throwing up on the floor. Thankfully, it's mostly water and his mom manages to jump back up in time, but it still leaves his throat feeling raw and his head pounding. Well, his head had kind of been pounding since last night, since he came back from the police station and collapsed into bed without even bothering to change. Wait. Izuku glances down at himself, and his mouth drops open in horror when he realizes that, yup, he's still in his costume, maroon hoodie and skin-tight black shirt and all. At least he had the presence of mind to take off the utility belt full of knives before throwing himself into bed, and he can see it along with his goggles and mask laid out neatly on his desk, which he definitely had not done last night. He doesn't really remember, to be honest, but he's pretty sure he just threw them on the floor. Izuku, his mom, tries again, and when he looks up at her, her smile is strained. Mom, he says, and now his jaw hurts. He reaches a hand up and feels the swollen, hot bruise. What happened, baby? She asks, her voice cracking, and Izuku swallows because his mom is many things, but stupid is not one of them. He's not going to get away with brushing this off, not when. Mom, he says, reaching back to run a hand through his hair and grimacing when he can feel the dye still in it. Have you been watching the news lately? She nods, then sighs, reaching up her hand to pinch the bridge of her nose. Her brow twitches. Izuku. Are you implying? She takes a deep breath, that you're Ace? Izuku is confused for just a second, then remembers the name he gave to Eraserhead last night. Maybe. He hopes his mom will think it's a joke, even though there's like 0 chance of that happening. Izuku. She says, wrapping her arms around him so suddenly it jostles his sore jaw, but he just hugs her back, surprised. God, you could have died and I wouldn't have even known where you were. That's what she's mad about. He thinks distantly. He can die, but she doesn't know that. I'm sorry, Mom. He says instead of protesting, sinking into her hug and shutting his eyes. He doesn't know why exactly his eyes are wet with tears, but some part of him recognizes how inevitable this was. He lives with her, lives alone with his mom who he's so close to. How could she not find out? He buries his face in her shoulder, ignoring the pain it sends shooting through his jaw and up into his temples. I didn't want to worry you, he says, voice muffled by her sweater. He knows he's getting hair dye and tears, and probably even vomit all over her, but he can't bring himself to care. Oh, Izuku, she says. You can tell me anything or nothing and I'm still going to worry. That's my job. She squeezes him. But I'd rather you tell me about stuff like this. Izuku hears a sniffle in her voice. I was so scared when I came in to check on you and saw that horrible bruise on your face. Izuku nods into her shirt. I'm sorry, he whispers. It's okay, baby, she replies. She stays home from work that day, brings him soup and helps him wash the dye out of his hair. He manages to talk her out of going to the doctor for his obvious concussion, but he can't do anything to stop her from keeping him in bed, bringing him his notes, and reading them out to him, so he won't have to read and strain his eyes, but can still study. She helps him put on clean, soft pajamas, and washes his costume carefully, folding it and setting it on top of his dresser when it's dry. He finds himself regretting having hidden it from her at all. The next time he goes on patrol, it's almost a week later. His mom hadn't wanted him going out until his concussion was fully healed, but she relented when his head stopped aching, and he stopped getting dizzy when standing up. She'd given him a little first aid kit to attach to his utility belt, too, which was nice. Izuku can't imagine using it on himself, but it'll be nice to have if he has to rescue someone. This patrol is different from the others because people keep stopping and calling out to him. The first time it happens, he's just walking along the sidewalk, hands in his hoodie pockets, enjoying the cool night breeze on his face, when he hears a voice call out to him. Hey, is that Ace? Izuku turns to look and sees a scruffy-looking man with a yellow beanie on. Dude, I saw you on the news. You're totally awesome. He punches the air with a fist. You totally saved that little kid. Izuku feels his face heat up, and he splutters for a moment before choking out, thank you. His voice comes out as a squeak, and the man chuckles, grinning. I knew they said you were a kid, but it's hard to believe. Have a nice night, Ace. He waves, turning and continuing to walk down the sidewalk like he had been before. Izuku stares after him. After that, he's a little less surprised when he hears people whispering his vigilante name and calling out to him in admiration. He guesses that despite no media being there when he fought the portal dude, his description in online articles got around well enough that people recognized him. At least some of the attention had to be because this area is where he was known to patrol. Of course, it's a local story. He doesn't think it's likely people would recognize him in another city or even another part of Nusatafu. He's crossing the street when he sees a girl across the street that lights up like it's Christmas when she sees him. He grits his teeth and finishes crossing the street. He can't stop traffic, even if there aren't many cars to stop in the first place. Thankfully, she doesn't seem interested in asking him a bunch of questions or taking pictures of him. That was the worst. He didn't want some random phone picture to end up outing him. Instead, she held out a small piece of paper to him. Hi, I don't know if you remember me. She's blushing. But you saved me a couple months ago and could I have your autograph? Izuku blinks in surprise, because he recognizes her. She was that girl from so many nights ago, the one with the biting quirk who'd been attacked by 3 guys in an alleyway. That was the night he'd met Eraserhead for the first time. It's surreal, seeing someone he'd saved again, smiling and safe instead of terrified with someone else's blood on her mouth. She's probably older than me, Izuku notes faintly as he nods, taking the piece of paper. It's a sheet of notebook paper. Who should I make it out to? He asks, sheepishly. I remember you, but I never got a name. Oh? She smiles. Just Hina is fine. Do you have a pen? Izuku asks, suddenly realizing he has nothing to sign it with. He can feel his face burning with embarrassment, and he hopes it doesn't show from under his mask. Yes, she says, reaching into her bag, a bright yellow toad, and pulling one out. She holds it out to him, and when he takes it, their fingers brush and she turns bright red. Sorry, I know this is embarrassing. You're just like my favorite hero, she says, tugging on her hair, while Izuku signs his vigilante name. I mean, I know you're not technically a hero, but you're so cool. And you don't have a combat quirk either, so it's even more impressive. And you were the only one who came and helped me, so you're my favorite. Izuku passes the pen and the note back to her, flushing bright red. Thank you, Hina, he says, giving her a slight bow. I have to, He waves a hand in the general direction he'd been going. Of course. She jumps out of the way. Good luck, Ace. He nods to her and, after a moment, gives her a thumbs up, then starts walking along the street. He manages to keep it together long enough to duck into an alleyway, where he has to sit on the ground and bury his burning hot face in his hands. He has fans. He has fans who are cute girls. He has fans who are cute girls and want his autograph because he's their favorite hero. He thinks he's going to die from being too flustered. Izuku? His mom asks one night while chopping carrots, her knife moving rhythmically. Yeah. He replies, looking up from his notebook where he was finishing his revised analysis page on Eraserhead. Why, Ace? I've been wondering why you picked that name, she asks, picking up the cutting board and using the knife to dump the sliced carrots into a pot of bubbling soup. Oh, Izuku replies, shrugging. That was kind of a spur-of-the-moment decision, really. Eraserhead asked for my vigilante name, and I didn't have one yet, so is Eraserhead the one who can cancel quirks? His mom asks, turning to look at him, leaning on the counter. Yeah. Izuku says, smiling. He's really cool. Honestly, I was going to say Deku at first, just because it's the only nickname I've had. He sees his mom's mouth twitch, and he knows she doesn't like that his only nickname is an insult. But then I thought that it kinda sounded like the English word for a deck of cards, you know. And the winning card is an ace, and cards are black and red like my costume, so. His mom smiles, then shakes her head. That's genius, Izuku, really. Here I thought it must have been the name of some hero I hadn't heard of. Izuku feels his face heat up. You really think so? That it's genius? Of course. Inko beams. You know, she says, putting a hand on her face thoughtfully. I could make some card-related patches to sew onto your costume. Really? He asks, his grin so wide it hurts the corner of his mouth. Izuku sits through the description of the practical portion of the exam with gritted teeth. He gets scolded for mumbling, but it doesn't do much except worsen the anxiety already buzzing under his skin. He knew that it would be difficult, but this? He doesn't know how he's going to get through it. The written portion has been easy enough, but he knows he didn't get 100%, and even if he did, bumming the practical is a sure way to guarantee he won't get in. There were only 36 spots for non-recommendation students, after all, and he's sure at least 36 students will do well enough on the practical to make up for Izuku doing better than them in the written portion. If he did better than them, which he probably didn't. His chest feels tight thinking about it, so he shakes the thought away, and tries to focus on what he's doing. When he gets to the battle center, he can see the way the others are talking about him. The tall, blue-haired boy with the thick calves who called him out during the presentation is bad enough, but the other guy's whispering. He tries his best to ignore their whispers, and he turns to see the girl who stopped him from tripping on the way to the exam. Her short brown hair is hiding her face from him as he approaches, hands clenched at his sides to give him something to focus on other than his nerves. A heavy hand comes down on his shoulder, and to his credit, he doesn't flinch as badly as he would have before his time on the streets. He still jumps though, and squeaks, a little embarrassing noise in his throat. When he turns and sees blue hair, he almost starts to tear up. What are you doing? The kid asks, towering over Izuku despite the fact that they're surely the same age. Can't you see she's trying to focus, right? Izuku answers, dropping his gaze down and to the side. His face burns with hot shame, and he curses himself for assuming that he'd be any different with social interactions now. He thought he'd gotten better, what with his confidence fighting in his costume, but it doesn't seem to have transferred over to his daily life. He still feels that familiar flutter of his heart and squeezing of his lungs when someone talks to him, that dread that they're going to hit him or yell. The other guy drops his hand and goes back to ignoring Izuku though, so he supposes he won't have to deal with getting into a fight right now. He starts when President Mix starts to announce again. Alright, the exam starts now. He pauses, and Izuku wonders if he's watching the shocked look on their faces. There aren't any countdowns in the hero world. Izuku freezes, staring at the model streets that stretch out before him, and even though he can hear everyone around him running and moving, he doesn't take a step. He finds that, even with all of his training in fighting and studying, he doesn't know what to do here. He doesn't know how to find a robot or how to take it down. It's not like the streets at night. Here, it's loud on all sides, the sounds of fighting surrounding him. He turns on his heels when he hears the screech of metal behind him, and he watches as a blond boy with violet eyes shoots a two-pointer down with a laser from his stomach. Izuku swallows, taking a step back, then starts to jog in a random direction. Somehow, he thought the exam would be something else. Something where knowledge or wits would be enough. As his shoes slap against the concrete, too clean to be like that of the actual city, he's hit with a wave of sickening despair. All he wants to do is hecking dispose himself, get a restart on this whole day. He can't though, not here. There's cameras everywhere, surely. They wouldn't let anyone die at the exam. He hears a creaking, crushing sound, and he rushes towards it. His shoes skid on loose rubble as he turns the corner, only to watch the blue-haired guy crush a robot with a neatly timed kick. Izuku hisses in frustration, whipping around and running the other direction. He just has to get as much information as he can this time, and pray that he resets before the start of the exam next time. He starts by running toward the boundary of the exam area, stopping at the tall concrete wall, and turning to run along it. If he gets a good mental map of the city, he'll have a better idea of where to go to defeat the robots. Or so he hopes. He can hear the sounds of fighting, but there don't seem to be many students around the edge like this, and he turns when he reaches the corner of the area, almost smacking directly into the body of a one-pointer. He hisses, skidding back and catching himself on the wall, barely avoiding losing his balance. The robot, all sharp gray metal, turns its head to look at him. Target acquired, it says, no inflection in its voice. Then it raises a metal arm and slams it down in a messy swipe that misses Izuku by a lot. Izuku realizes, then, that he might actually have a chance if he fights these things. He reaches his hand for his utility belt and hisses in frustration to find nothing. Of course, he hadn't brought it. He's supposed to be an ordinary middle school kid right now. Izuku hops out of the way of another swipe, then ducks forward, underneath the robot's chin. He thrusts a palm upward, the meat of his hand striking the metal, and pushing the robot's head up a little ways. It jerks, a metallic noise, and Izuku slides back, shaking out his hand. The metal is hard and unyielding, and Izuku almost misses punching people. Almost. The robot turns like it's going to try and hit him again, but Izuku meets its swipe with a wide kick, and to his surprise, it completely knocks the leg of the robot off. He blinks, then remembers these are supposed to be easy, that's why they're 1 point. He grins, then aims another kick at the robot's head, this time not trying to be cautious of its limbs. Sure enough, the head pops off and lands on the nearby ground with a clang, and the robot stops, stiff and frozen in place. 1 point, Izuku mutters, then takes off running around the perimeter again. He knows better than to think 1 point is enough, but it's still something, and Izuku feels infinitely better for it. 4 minutes remaining. Present Mick's voice calls, and Izuku winces, picking up his pace. He'll have to find something tall to jump off of right after, for the best chance of it resetting him far enough back, but he should still use these 4 minutes to do something. He hears a crash, something louder and heavier than the other robots, and he whips around to see what has to be a 0-pointer, its head poking up from where it stands in the center of the mock city. Isaac swallows, then shakes his head and runs toward it. The perimeter can wait, he needs information on the 0-pointers as well, if he wants to be able to successfully avoid them next time. A few other kids run past him, moving in the opposite direction. He figures that nobody wants to get slowed down by the obstacle, and Izuku would be doing the same thing under normal circumstances. Instead, he runs, skirting around the side of a broken robot and racing toward the 0-pointer, the huge robot that towers over the buildings. He hears her before he sees her, just a tiny whimper that barely reaches his ears. It's probably only because the other kids had destroyed so many of the lower-level robots that he hears it in the first place, and he zeroes in on the source of the sound, the girl with the gravity quirk, trapped under a huge piece of rubble and staring up at him, her face flushed and sweaty. Izuku doesn't even think, he runs forward, a hand extended already. He can see the 0-pointer swinging an arm down at him to attack, the movement clear enough even in his peripheral vision, but he doesn't care. He'll save her even if it disposes him. Except he doesn't get there in time. The robot hits him first, a giant sweeping strike that pulls him up off his feet and tosses him like a toy into the side of one of the buildings, almost 2 stories off the ground. He gasps as the breath is knocked out of him, his vision whiting out for a moment with a burst of pain in his back. He feels himself sliding down the building, then feels his legs crumple when he hits the ground, watching himself on all fours and shaking in place. He's concussed for sure, because he doesn't remember the exam ending or being taken to the infirmary. Things start to clear up when Recovery Girl gives him a healing kiss, but his mind stays too blurred to be healthy. He thanks her for her help and walks out of the infirmary into campus, straight for the fire escape he knows is tall enough for the jump to dispose him. He climbs it and jumps off, even though it's broad daylight and someone could see him. He doesn't care, he just needs another try. Can't you see she's trying to focus? Blue hair kid snaps at him, and Izuku just blinks in response, trying to reorient himself. He must be outside the battle center, right before the exam starts. It's pretty much ideal, since he can start with the full time of the test. Are you alright? Blue hair folds his arms over his chest. You're muttering again. Izuku looks up at him, sees he's raised one eyebrow in a look of disapproving concern. Izuku replies eloquently, shaking his head. I'm okay. I just mumble when I think he replies, and the blue-haired kid just sighs. Present Mick's voice covers whatever he says in response. Alright, the exam starts now. Izuku doesn't hesitate this time. He sprints off toward where he remembers a one-pointer, even before the other kids start moving. He thinks he hears somebody shouting after him, but he ignores it, instead spinning around to kick the one-pointer's head right off of its body. He bites back the urge to grin stupidly, instead taking off toward the one-pointer he found at the perimeter last time. He knows he's got about 6 minutes until they spawn in the zero-pointer, so he can spend the first 5 or so collecting points, then he'll need to go and try to save the girl with the gravity quirk and the nice brown eyes. He knows he doesn't have to, it's just an exam, they wouldn't let her get hurt, but he wants to. The minutes fly by, his breath coming quick as he takes down a second and third one-pointer. He's running back for the center already when Present Mick announces the time, and the crash of the zero-pointer entering the arena doesn't startle him this time. He runs, cool and collected toward the center. He feels like a hero. And then he sees the rock collapse on the girl, and he knows what he has to do. He runs forward, towards her with a hand outstretched. He skids to a stop in front of her, and she takes his hand, her face pained and her breath coming out as a wheezing gasp. He tugs, feeling her muscles tense as she tries to use the motion to pull herself free, but it doesn't work. He grimaces. Hold on, he says, and he skirts around behind her, to where the rock is pinning her down. He kneels to get a better look, and oh, her left leg is completely pinned. It doesn't look crushed, but He tries to lift the stone, but when he does, the rocks surrounding her rumble worryingly, and it doesn't really budge more than an inch or two. Is it working? The girl asks, and he glances over to see her craning her neck back to watch. He bites his lip. I don't think so, he replies, and she frowns. I can try to use my quirk, she says, reaching a hand back, struggling, but it doesn't quite reach the rock on her legs. She groans, stretching, and Izuku hears something loud above them. He looks up just in time to see the zero-pointer about to smash into them, and instinctively, he closes his eyes, waiting to wake up. Except, after a moment, when he opens his eyes, the 0-pointer is frozen inches from his face, and Present Mick is announcing the end of the test. Izuku is still staring at the 0-pointer. It occurs to him that he only has 3 points. Are you okay? The girl asks, even though she's still under the rubble. He sees a number of smaller bots, clearly some kind of helpers to get the girl out from under the rubble. Yeah, he answers, and he doesn't know what kind of look he has on his face, but she frowns. I'm fine. He walks right out of the test, and they let him go because he's uninjured. He walks to Aldera Middle School, this time, instead of a random fire escape. He jumps off of it and wonders if he should even bother trying next time. He opens his eyes just in time for that kid to say, "Can't you see she's trying to focus?" Izuku turns to him, annoyed all of a sudden. He wants this kid to shut up and let him have a moment. What's your name? He asks instead of snapping like he wants to, makes himself take a deep breath. The kid blinks. Tenya Ida. Izuku Midoriya. Izuku replies to be polite. He turns to look into the city, takes a deep breath. The second the Present Mick starts speaking, Izuku takes off. The first few minutes of the test are a blur. He knows he takes down the same 3 1-pointers as last time, but he doesn't remember getting the bruise on the outside of his arm, and he doesn't know if he took down the 3-pointer to his left, or if someone just left its body near him. He suddenly slips back into focus like waking up after sleeping or taking a breath after being underwater, and it's a disconcerting feeling. He hasn't ever lost time like that, not before, and he doesn't know how to feel about it. I don't have time to worry about my mental state, he thinks as he hears Mick make the 4-minute announcement. He's already pretty close to the center, but this time, he stops at the crumbled body of a 2-pointer before running over to the girl. He'd watch Ida take this one down the first time through, and as he picks up a long piece of metal, about the length of one of his legs, and thick enough to be sturdy, but thin enough for him to use it like a crowbar. He hopes this works, because he isn't repeating the test again because the test isn't fair. He feels bitterness rise in his chest, hot and stifling, as he runs to the piles of rubble that just fell. The girl sees him coming, and he shouts at her. What's your name? He takes a breath. I'm going to get you out of there, Ichako Araka. She replies. And that would be really nice. He grins at that, sliding to a stop in front of the rubble, and shoving the end of the metal underneath it. I'm gonna try to lift the rock up, he says, pushing it deeper under the stone. When you can reach it, he grunts, starting to move the rubble. Use your quirk on it. His voice is strained and he has to squeeze his eyes shut, pushing down on the makeshift lever with all of his body weight. He can hear the 0-pointer above them, but he doesn't open his eyes because he knows it'll distract him. Suddenly, the weight of the rock disappears and he trips forward, stumbling. Got it. Uraraka shouts, and he opens his eyes just in time to see her catching him, stopping him from face-planting in the ground. Second time I got you, she says, grinning, and he returns the smile. Let's get out of here, she says, tugging him forward and running away from the 0-pointer. Izuku can tell from the way she's running that her ankle hurts, and he bites his lip, then tugs her down a narrow alleyway. Your ankle is hurt, he shouts over the noise of the 0-pointer. The test is about to end, so it'll stop chasing us soon anyway. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the only thing he brought from his utility belt, the first aid kit his mom gave him. Oh? She says, her eyes widening. You're so smart. I didn't even think to bring a medical kit. Izuku feels his face heat up as he gets out an ace bandage. It's nothing special, really, he says, wrapping her ankle up carefully, the way his mom showed him to. The test is over. Present Mick shouts, and Izuku sighs, biting his lip and finishing the wrap of her ankle. I only got 28 points, she says, sighing. I don't know if that's enough to get in. Don't worry, Izuku says. You did a lot better than me. Thanks for watching, you beautiful people. If you enjoyed, like, share and sub. You can check other what ifs on the channel. I'll see you around.